live any moment.
Thanks, Chris.
The meeting is officially live.
Thanks, Chris. All right, Council, it's 5 o'clock. Time to get down to work. Today, we acknowledge that this event is taking place on the traditional territory of the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, including the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Ojibwe peoples, and on lands connected with the Lake Simcoe Nottawasaga Treaty of 1818. This is the home of a diverse range of Indigenous peoples whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society. We have had regrets from Deputy Mayor Hall. He will not be able to join us tonight, and Councillor Jeffrey may have to field an important call during the meeting, so Councillor Jeffrey, feel free to do that. First up will be the adoption of the agenda, and it is moved by Councillor McLeod and seconded by Councillor Comey, that the content of the Strategic Initiative Standing Committee agenda for July 8, 2020 be adopted as amended. And the amendments include item 5.7, Ethnic Mosaic Alliance, read letter of interest to support a multicultural center in Collingwood. Item 6.6, update and guidance for COVID-19 response for parks. CAO Skinner and Executive Director, or sorry, Acting Director of PRC, Mel Mlanovich. And item 6.7, Lobbyist Registry update, Accountability Officer, Macaulay. And resolution and attachment added for 6.6, update and guidance for COVID-19 response for parks. Are there any questions or concerns, Council? Seeing none, I will call the vote. All in favor? And that is carried unanimously. Declarations of pecuniary interest and the general nature thereof. Anyone have a declaration of pecuniary interest today? Seeing none, if you find yourself in that spot or your pet, let us know and indicate the general nature thereof. Item 4, staff reports. 4.1, T 2020-9, development charge interest policy. And I think, who will be handling that, CAO Skinner? Will that be Marjorie?
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. That will be Marjorie, who will provide an overview of that item and several items following it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, it's the retiring treasurer's role tonight.
Got a busy night, Marjorie.
Yeah. Okay, so through you, Your Worship, the development charge interest policy, it's a report that the purpose of it is to provide council with information related to 2 significant changes to the Development Charges Act under Bills 108 and 138. These major changes are intended to encourage increased housing development, affordability, and predictability throughout the province. Both of these changes will have a negative impact on the cash flow of development charge collections. The first major change relates to the timing of collection for rental housing, institutional development, and nonprofit housing development. So these developments are allowed to defer payment of the DCs over 6 years for the rental and institutional developments and 21 years for nonprofit housing. The legislation does allow the municipality to charge interest on the outstanding amount of development charges from the date they would have been payable until paid in full. Second major change is in relation to the timing of the calculation of the development charges themselves. Development charges will be frozen for a 2-year period at either date of an application for a site plan control, or in the absence of the application, the date of a zoning bylaw amendment, or if neither of those 2 items occurs, it'll be done as it is now at the issuance of a building permit. So the development charge rate is frozen at the time of application for a period of 2 years, after which, if the developer has not pulled a building permit, it will go back to the building permit issuance itself. And again, this part of the legislation does allow the municipality to charge interest on the outstanding amount of DCs from the date they would have been payable until the DCs are paid in full. And there are several municipalities so far in Simcoe County that, including the county, that have implemented these interest policies. The reason I wanted to get it done and get it done rather quickly is the fact that we have already received building permit requests for 2 rental developments in town that we're going to have to get ready to enter into the when they get their full occupancy or wherever they'll be there. So I did review several interest policies, and in effect, that what I'm doing is I'm just recommending that the town is consistent with Simcoe County's interest rate calculation. It's just one calculation that we would do for ourselves and for the county at the same time, because we'll be in charge of collecting that interest as well. And basically the county has just defined it. It's rather easy, but it's defined to be the rate equal to the published bank prime rate on that day plus 3%. And it's only through the charging of this interest on these DCs that we can, in any way, shape, or form, mitigate any of the negative impacts. Those impacts are lost revenue due to the changes in calculation and timing of calculation. The freezing of development charges for a 2-year period, for instance, allows a developer to skip over potentially 2 indexations of the fees during that 2-year period. Cash flow deficits to pay for infrastructure, because we have to have the infrastructure in place before any development can occur. And also these agreements that require signing by both parties, we would have to track them manually, ensure that we invoice them and report them in the correct way. So there would be some staff time involved as a negative impact on this. But other than that, the policy is very similar to the one that the county had prepared. And it's, again, as I say, it follows the framework that the other municipalities in Simcoe County have been using. Be it, Your Worship.
Seeing none, I have a question, Marjorie. If you could just explain for us and for the public the difference between the frozen DCs and the phased-in DCs, and how that's going to impact us.
Through you, Your Worship. The phased-in development charges are the fact that on for the rental properties, we have 2 rental buildings that have come in that they would probably have potential development charges of a couple of $100,000. And instead of getting all of that money up front to provide the servicing to the lots that are the properties they are being built on, we will collect that over 6 years. But I do have the right to charge interest on the outstanding amounts each year as they go. So I'd be getting that over 6 years. If it's a nonprofit housing development, it would be coming in over 21 years. And in terms of the frozen, it's a maximum of 2 years. So we would, in either case, we would be losing the indexation of the development charges themselves, because once we have it's actually at the occupancy date for the rental properties, that freezes it at that time. And when we come in and get a site plan approval, it freezes your development charges at that date. So you would have 2 years that you wouldn't heavy indexation. And I have no idea at this point in time which way interest rates are going to go or which way inflation is going to go. It could be more beneficial to continue to charge the interest rate at this prime +3 as opposed to just the indexation of the things that are going through.
Thank you, Marjorie. Councillor Hamlin?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to our treasurer. You mentioned we could experience cash flow deficits as a result of having to front end our infrastructure before we get the development charge payments in. I know your next reports deal in part with increasing our debt loads. Do you anticipate this also to affect our ongoing debt situation as well?
Through you, Your Worship. At this point in time, if we're required to borrow for development charge projects, the payments will be made through the development charge reserve or the development charge collections as they come in. There may be points in time where we're not collecting higher development charges in sufficient amounts to cover the debenture payments. But when we're talking about development charges, and we have 9 different separate reserve funds within there, we have water, we have wastewater, parks, and so on, and the vast majority of those will still exist even with the final changes that they're proposing to Bill 138. So as long as overall our entire development charge reserve funds don't go into a negative position, we can still borrow back and forth within the water could lend the roads the extra that they need or whatever to make sure that we cover those debenture payments all within the DC funds.
Okay, thank you. And I just have one further question. That is, have you had any discussions with our developers? Are they finding prime +3, it might be worth going to their bank and could they get a lower interest rate?
Through you, Your Worship, that's it's entirely possible in today's situation that they could go to the bank and get a lower interest rate. And this is actually their decision.
Yeah.
If they want to do this or not, if they want to defer it, if they want to defer it, I have no choice. Mm-hmm. If they don't want to defer it, they can carry on and pay it all up front. It will be one of those calculations that is done by at building department or site plan approval. So by having to source one interest rate, I thought it would be easier, which is why I stuck with what the county had.
Okay, thank you so much.
And the clerk has kindly reminded me that this is an SIC meeting, so we need to go out to the public. So looking to the clerk, Sarah, are there any of our audience that have questions on this report?
Through you, Your Worship, to anybody that is watching, if you are interested in participating with regards to the delegation process for a standing committee, raise your hand in the attendee feature within the Zoom meeting. Or enter your request in the chat. And right now, it does not look like our attendees wish to speak to this matter.
Okay, if there's no other questions from council, then I will put the motion on the table. And it is moved by Councillor McLeod and seconded by Councillor Comey that staff report T2020-9 development charge interest policy be received and that the development charge interest policy attached as Appendix A be adopted by council. So I will call the vote. All in favor? And that is carried unanimously. And that takes us to item 4.2, T2020-10, Statement of Reserves and Reserve Funds. Pass it back to you, Marjorie.
Thank you, Worship. So this year we added a French section, Sonia thought it would probably be a little more background for council when we start getting into budget discussions later on in the year. So I have provided a short refresher on why we have reserves and the distinction between the types of reserves available. So basically, in short, reserves and reserve funds are critical components of our financial plan because they allow the town to accumulate funds for future or contingent liabilities. They help absorb unexpected shifts in revenues and expenditures. They fund one-time expenditure requirements, and they assist in minimizing impacts due to fluctuations in the various tax revenues that we may have. In terms of what is a reserve, it's an allocation of the accumulated net revenue, and it's not associated with a specific asset. They're usually used in the operating fund to support or supplement activities normally funded through general revenues. And a couple of examples of those are things like, and I did say they're specifically or mostly used for operating, but we do have a capital contingency fund, and we have an operating contingency reserve. So if there is something in the capital that goes overboard, we do have some money in the contingency for capital expenditures. If we have a problem with the operating amounts, we would have operating contingency to cover some of those items. So we take a look at reserve funds. They're monies that are set aside either by municipal bylaw or as a requirement of the federal or provincial legislation to meet a specific purpose. And the funds can only be used for that purpose. So the main distinction that we have between a reserve and a reserve fund is that a reserve fund itself is an active investment vehicle that earns interest and builds up to a level that allows the specific project that the fund was established for to be completed. We have a reserve fund for municipal parking, and one of the outcomes of that is possibly a parking structure. So as we go along and we put the excess parking revenues in that reserve annually, we're saving up to buy the land or the infrastructure that we need for that. So we have reserves are then further segregated into obligatory reserve funds, which are related to the grant funds that we receive or fees that are collected based on legislation. And the two best examples of those are the federal gas tax and development charges. They have specific uses and specific requirements for them. The second type of reserve funds are the discretionary reserve funds, and they're established based on council direction to finance future expenditures for which the town has the authority to spend money on or to provide for a specific contingent liability. For instance, we could be, we have a contingent liability on our financial statements in relation to Collingwood terminals was set up last year. We could be putting money into a terminals reserve to mitigate that contingent liability that we will have in the future. But in particular, when you look at it, we have the life cycle replacement reserve fund, we have the water reserve fund and the wastewater reserve fund, which are probably the best examples of that because we use a life cycle to cover our asset management requirements for vehicles, buildings, and roads, and basically for anything that's non-water or wastewater related. The water and wastewater reserve funds fund their own capital and operating expenditures as needed. So when we take a look at the balances this year, our reserve balances decreased by about $414,000 from $6.5 million to $6.12 million. And if we take out the reserves that we hold in trust for the library and the BIA, The balance of reserves under council control is 5.76 million, or a decrease of 501,775. The reason for the decrease, you will get to it later in the fourth quarter variance analysis. However, the reason for the decrease is we didn't have a surplus this year, so we couldn't top up the items like our contingent capital contingency reserve and our general reserve, and we had to withdraw $232,666 from the operating contingency to bring our operating fund to zero, to balance that budget. The obligatory reserves, these funds increased $2.5 million to $6 million, with our federal gas tax accounting for the majority of that increase. And the reason is that we got the top up of, we got double the amount of federal gas tax thanks to FCM last year. And we do have $2.6 million of those funds committed in the 2020 budget. So we're not, we have certain timeframes that we have to spend the money. We have quotas that we have to meet. In terms of the federal gas tax, we have to make sure that we have it all spent within 5 years. So my oldest deposit has to be fully spent in 5 years. The discretionary reserve funds, they actually increased $2.7 million to a balance of $58 million. Now, the 2020 budget has committed $11.8 million in capital spending, strictly from the life cycle, the water, and the wastewater reserve funds. When I say it's sitting at $58 million, we have $17.6 million of that, which is in the asset sale proceed funds. So really, I shouldn't mention it, but it is there. So just to let everybody know, when we see our audited financial statements in September, that the number will be that 58 million. Then I took a look at this in terms of adequacy based on the reserve and the reserve fund management policy, and involved with the other organizations that we're involved with that provide statistics on it. The GFOA, the Government Finance Officers Association, Ministry of Municipal Affairs, and in all cases, in what they have said, that we are still within the accepted ranges. In some cases, we're starting to hit the lower 1/3, but if we looked strictly at that statistic, we would be in probably in the mid range for that. However, if we take a longer term view, we really are underfunded, particularly in the asset management area. And we have been basing our target balances on a particularly short-term perspective. We are getting to the point where our asset management plans are getting much more refined. This year, the last big piece of core assets is the stormwater management. Those have all been inventoried now. We're waiting on the condition assessments to get those into the asset management plan, which will then provide us with what we truly have as an infrastructure gap. And I'm hoping that we can get that to council before the end of the year. And then we will have some more realistic or more tangible targets to allow council to make the decisions as to how we're going to fund that in the future. When we take a look at those reserves, the one big gap that we do have is that the working capital reserve fund has been fully exhausted. What we do have in the budget is an annual funding for that reserve of $50,000. So its target balance is 2.5 million. So at the $50,000 rate, that's going to take us about 50 years to rebuild to where we should be. Now, again, that that depends on what type of year-end surpluses there are, because the working capital reserve fund does factor into the surplus allocation policy that we have. Life cycle funding is really where we fund the asset management requirements for everything except water and wastewater requirements. And what we should have been doing is sticking strictly to looking at the hard services or the core services. But the amount of money that we have in life cycle is used for everything. It's used for buildings, it's used for vehicles, it's used for things that are falling apart and we have to fix. So we have budgeted 4.9 million to withdraw from that reserve during 2020. And we have an additional requirement for about $2.6 million for emergency repairs to the Minnesota storm sewer. So you will find later, again in another report, but also at budget time, that staff will be recommending that the 2021 budget deliberations consider an increase in the capital levy from the 0.75% to the 2%, which will go in with the special capital levy amounts that is to be used for future asset refurbishment or replacement.
Thank you, Marjorie. And before I put this on the floor for council, I will look to Clerk Thomas to see if there's anyone in the gallery that would like to comment or ask a question on this.
Again, anybody that is in the gallery wishing to speak to this matter, if they can either raise their hand or enter in the chat that you would like to speak. And there's no interest to speak to this item at this time.
All right, thank you, Sarah. So I'll put the motion on the floor and then take questions from council. So it's moved by Councillor Comey and seconded by Councillor Madigan. Staff report T2020-10, statement of reserves and reserve funds be received for information purposes. Council, are there any questions or comments before I call the vote? Councillor Jeffrey.
Thank you, Mayor Saunderson. I know for about a year and a half or so, we've been waiting for the information we need to assess whether or not we need to adjust the automatic or procedural allocation of the surplus automatically to life cycle. And I guess my question would be through to the treasurer, do we have enough information to be looking at that bylaw to change that or just to review it?
Marjorie?
Through you, Your Worship. Councillor Jeffrey, I would suggest that this year and last year for the town of Collingwood are probably two very unique years. We did have, and you will see later, that we did have supplementary taxes, but because of the higher expenditures than we planned, we didn't have a surplus. We could look at it in those terms over the past 4 or 5 years. But then when we go forward into 2020, the province has postponed the 2020 reassessment. So when we go into 2021 budget period, we're still going to be working with the same assessments that we have in 2020. The only true amount that we will have there are the new assessments that are coming on. It won't be anything to do with any type of an increase in the assessment values overall. It would actually be a true growth. And at this point in time, I was looking at it, we checked it today. Our growth is about 1.3%, which is approximately half to slightly less than half of where we have been over the last 2 or 3 years. So I would suggest that that may be something to look at in 2021.
Councillor Jeffrey?
Yes, and just one other question, please, through you, Mr. Mayor. So if FCM is successful in getting, when we're successful in getting the feds in advancing municipalities, the emergency operating funds, is that going to assist us in any way in terms of, well, I guess in terms of being able to have a little more room in terms of the working capital reserve. Operating working reserve.
Through you, your worship. If FCM is like when I did the forecast, you saw that I forecasted a deficit for 2020, right? Based on the information at that point in time. As things go on and as we have to open up more facilities, washrooms, for instance, and the extra cleaning that we're going to have, the parking and those types of things, the expenses are coming along a little bit more. And in terms also as well of the bus, we're still not charging fares. So what that funding should do, should allow us some room in certain areas that we can continue to make our transfers to the life cycle reserve and those other funds that are there.
That's great. Thank you.
Council, any other questions? Councillor McLeod?
Thank you, through your worship, to the treasurer. Thank you for that report. And I know this is 2 down, 4 to go. You did mention in the in this report, and I think this kind of relates to the variance report that we're going to get in a minute or two, but I'm trying to get it clear in my head. When you say we didn't have a surplus, that's because we aren't allowed to run a deficit, and we had to use all of our supplementary taxes plus a chunk out of our working capital reserve in order to get to zero. Is that correct?
Through you, your worship, yes, that is correct. It was not just the supplementary taxes. There were, as you will see, there were savings throughout the various departments, but we didn't really have any experience with funding a judicial inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? I'm not sure many municipalities did. So when the prior CAO and I were looking at it, we thought, well, this is a nice round number, but apparently it wasn't round enough. So we had to take, and in order to preserve the asset sale funds, we had to take the money from wherever we could to make our budget come to zero.
A follow-up through you, your worship.
Go ahead.
May I know the number of that is connected to supplementary taxes for the year 2019, please?
I believe we had 1,015,622 in net supplementary tax revenues.
So if I'm looking at a different report, sorry, through you, your worship, I'm looking through another report and I see tax-related revenues were over budget by 1,057,194. That's not the same number as what you just said, or is it?
Through you, your worship. Yes, there were a couple of other items that are tax that fit in with tax related. One of them is heads and beds, and it was a little higher this year. We have PILs that come in that were just a little higher than budgeted because the assessed values had changed. This year we did the budget prior to having the certified roll. So when you do the calculations, it kind of changes things a bit.
Right. So just to clarify, the supplementary taxes was 1,015,000.
Yeah.
Okay. And change, whatever.
And change. It's 1,015,622. Some of that might have also been extra interest earned.
Thank you. That's a piece of information I won't have to ask for in the next report. Thank you very much, Your Worship.
You're welcome. Any other questions, Council? Councillor Comey.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Through you to the Treasurer, thank you for your thorough reports and presentation. That wonderful gas tax funding, I believe you said it's been committed. Is that what you said?
Marjorie?
Through your worship, some of it has been committed with this. We have some work to do on Mountain Road. We have work to do on Lockhart and here Ontario that we will be using.
Okay.
Yeah, the widenings because it is essentially easier for the greenhouse gas calculations that we can use turning lanes, road widenings. When we go to do Mountain Road, I believe we're going to make it a five lane road. So because it's 4 in some spots, we can only claim 1 lane against it. The other spots that are 2, we can claim the full amounts with that. But that's where we have it kind of committed in those sorts of areas. It'll be mostly in the next couple of years Mountain Road, because we have grant money that we can use with that as well.
Okay, thank you so much.
Council, any other questions before I call the vote? Seeing none, all in favor? And that is carried unanimously. Thank you, Marjorie. So next, we have T 2020-12 update on debt.
Thank you, Worship. Since the adoption of the debt management policy, which provided target debt servicing costs, the town has made significant progress towards those targets. Actually, today when I was looking at my notes for tonight, I went back to the original report so I can reference some of those numbers in there. So we did arrive at tax supported debt servicing costs as a percentage of own source revenues as a target of 7%. And the water rate supported debt and wastewater rate supported debt both have 7% as their percent of respective own source revenues as the debt servicing target. In terms of external debt, when we began preparing debt related reports for the 2014 year end, I believe the first report we produced was January of 2015, it came to council. At that time, external debt was $37 million and debt servicing costs were 10.7%. And 5 years later, the debt level has been reduced to $20,800,000 with servicing costs of 8.06%. So that's basically just a result of the regular principal repayments. So those figures don't really include the debt assumed during the college share sale, since those debentures are not paid by the taxpayer or the ratepayer. We actually produce an invoice to Collis or EPCOR. I'm still going to always call it Collis, but to EPCOR every month for the amounts that they owe us in terms of the debenture payments. And the only impact that those outstanding amounts have on the municipality are in relation to our annual borrowing limit. But I don't feel that that's not really a significant impact when you take a look at the fact that the ministry has calculated that our annual repayment limit is around $8.8 million. So at this point in time, we're already spending $4.9 million, but we could borrow another $8.8 million with our revenues. It would be tight. It would be a pressure on the taxpayer. We'd be looking at service cuts. We'd be looking at those other types of things to make the taxes more affordable for the people. But that's what they're saying, which if you take a look at that, the 8.8 million, that means that we could borrow an additional $110 million in debenture money over 20 years. And that's using a 5% interest rate. When I was talking to Infrastructure Ontario to get the figures for the new debt calculations, a 20-year debenture right now is 2% interest. If you ever wanted to borrow, go get some. I don't want to borrow. The internal debt that we have in 2014, that internal debt was $8.9 million. And the debt servicing costs were 1.21%. So that balance has actually been reduced to $5,557,000, and the debt servicing costs have gone down 0.85%. And that reduction has actually occurred through a combination of monthly payments for the promissory note between water and wastewater, a budgeted repayment minimum of $150,000 a year, and an allocation of surplus in accordance with the surplus allocation policy so that we can get some of those amounts paid down. So unfortunately, this year we didn't have a surplus, so the 150,000 is plus the wastewater note are the only amounts that we could reduce that by. Committed debt, 5 years ago, the committed debt figure stood at $2.5 million and an estimated 0.51 in debt servicing costs. That committed debt has decreased to $1.3 million. And the interest rates, as I just mentioned, have decreased significantly. So if we were to borrow today for a 10-year debenture, the rate would be 1.54%. And with that in mind, it does decrease the debt servicing cost to 0.23%. So overall, in the 5 years that we've been tracking debt and providing updates, the debt servicing costs have decreased from 12.42% to 9.17%. The component parts of the debt indicate that tax-supported debt servicing costs are 3.2 million or 7.57%. We almost hit the target. The wastewater debt servicing costs are 471,000, and that brings to 7.16. We almost hit the target. Wastewater costs are still up there. They're 1.7 million, and that's 17.9%. So just to let you know, right, there's 3 debentures that will be paid in full this year, which will reduce the wastewater percentage to 11.89%, and the tax supported percentage will decrease to 6%. So we will be under the target, and it's entirely up to council if they wish to refine the targets, keep them where they are, review what's going on. I believe that later on this year, staff will be bringing forward a report on our reserve funds and the target balances that we have. It's time to review them to make sure that they're still in line with the way things should be. So when we still continue on with the debt, we take a look at the potential debt. There are still several projects in that 5 to 10 year capital budget that don't have funding sources at this time. So over the next 6 to 7 years, there is a potential of $34 million in projects. One of them being the 15 million that was in relation to the waterfront master plan. It would be the largest that would be there, and 8 million for the terminals. So we need to determine how they're going to be funded, either through taxes or debt or grants. And some of these projects, especially the wastewater treatment plant, is heavily dependent on development charges. So this may be part of the cash deficiency when we're talking about whether the DC collections for wastewater will keep pace with the expenditures as far as the plant expansion goes. And again, that's as I explained earlier, that what will happen is, as long as we can maintain our overall balance in development charges in a positive figure, we can borrow back and forth between them and kind of wait till we do have the collections there. However, don't ever discount the fact that at some point in time, the ratepayers, or depending on what type of a project it is, even the taxpayers may have to kick in until the development charges actually do get collected. Again, with these policies, we have the pay-as-you-go policy, which was adopted by council, and it was in relation to assisting in reducing the debt levels, and I believe that to a large extent that it has. I would think at this point in time, it may behoove council and staff to review that policy to see if you still want to maintain it, if you want to modify it, if you want to carry on. You just have to remember that there are limitations with that policy. It and it really it can impact our ability to fund projects and react to unexpected events, COVID, for instance. But you know, it forces us to focus on the operating expenses and service levels of our operating budget. So it makes it difficult to find room for major capital projects within the budget if they require a large portion of, well, I shouldn't say a large portion, but if the tax supported portion is, for instance, 1/3 of a grant project and we're short, it will maybe make us not spend the grant money and lose it in the future or something like that. And the large infrastructure projects just tend not to lend themselves to efficiently being spread out over several stages in a manner that would facilitate a pay-as-you-go financing. Now, when it came, for instance, when it came time to do Hume Street, we were lucky. We had saved enough development charges. We had the ability to use federal gas tax. We received federal and provincial funding, and if I recall correctly, it was down to we had $2 million left from the initial share sale of Collis that basically we funded that whole project. So they could start, took them a while, they could start, but they didn't have to stop as they went along the street. They could carry on and not just do the section between here, Ontario and St. Marie and wait for a year to collect the money to do the next section. Right? Again, grant opportunities may influence the decisions that we make in the future because it may provide funding for a lower priority project, and it may influence us to go there and to spend money that we maybe really should think twice about. And again, this one is also a question of the intergenerational equity. Is it fair for us to think people pay up front for what they're going to use over the next 20 years? And that's one of the fundamentals behind the matching of the asset's lifetime over the debenture, if that's the way you currently choose to go. So in terms of what we're facing in going along with that pay-as-you-go, we're currently facing a situation where certain projects have had to be moved further out in order to accommodate an emergency storm sewer repair. That's not necessarily a situation entirely on a pay-as-you-go limitation, but it has forced other things out of the way. But it's totally also an asset management plan funding problem. We don't have enough in the pot to do everything, so something had to move back. And now I'm going to talk about asset management. The CAO may want to add some comments on this. So Council did receive an update on our asset management plan in December 2019. I believe that we are still facing a potential $9 million infrastructure gap. The legislation actually indicates that each time we repair a road, a sewer, or a building, we should be increasing the amount of money that we are placing in reserve to repair or replace that asset at the end of its useful life. And some of these assets have 40 and 75-year useful lives. So it does give us a longer time to do it. But a lot of this stuff is non-residential construction, and the non-residential construction index is increasing faster because of the components it's involved in than the consumer price index. So when we have a target inflation rate of 2%, the non-residential index may grow at a significantly larger amount. So we need to make sure that we're compensating for that over the 75 years. And again, the legislation does indicate that each time we consider investing in a brand new asset, not replacing an existing asset, whether it's a building or adding an additional vehicle to the fleet or building a new park, that the cost to replace that asset at the end of its useful life should be placed in reserve so that the funds are there when that useful life has been reached. So one of the examples that I used in the staff report is the bus terminal. So there are several components to the building that will require maintenance over the estimated 40-year life. We're going to have to replace the HVAC. The window seals are going to not last forever. We're going to, the washrooms are going to have to be renovated. So those will be maintenance that need to be built into the plan itself. So we'll have the money in 10 years to replace the HVAC, or we'll have $6,000 or whatever it is to replace the windows. But just in terms of the building itself, the cost was $509,000. And if you're using an inflation rate of the target inflation rate of 2%, we would require a reserve of $1.1 million in 40 years to replace that building if we just did it the same as it is. And so based on that, we should be putting aside $28,000 strictly in reserve for that asset. And I know that staff have indicated in many reports too, and discussions with council, that the method we're using to fund our asset management plan, it's just simply not sustainable. We're not the only municipality that's facing that, but it's not sustainable. And in fact, the province has provided a prescriptive regulation that governs the asset management plan contents. If there is something that life cycle activities are not planned to be undertaken in the 2-year period, if it's a storm sewer or mountain road or whatever, the municipality will have to explain how you're going to manage any risks involved with not doing the required maintenance or replacement of that asset. And again, at this point, I think that staff will be recommending that the special capital levy be increased from 0.75 to 2% during the 2021 budget deliberations. Turn it back to you. CAO, do you have comments?
Very well done, Treasurer Leonard. Thank you.
All right. I will look then to Clerk Almas. Is there anyone in our gallery that would like to speak to this item?
Through your worship, we do have 2 additional attendees that have joined. So just a reminder that you can raise your hand on the toolbar on the bottom of your screen, or enter your question in the chat if you have any questions regarding this report. And there appears to be no questions regarding this report.
All right, let's get the item on the floor. I'm working from the wrong one here. So it was T 2020 update on debt. It's moved by Councillor Madigan and seconded by Councillor Doherty. The council received staff report T 2020-12 for information purposes consistent with the town's strategic financial plan, and approve the recommendations contained therein. Council, are there questions or comments before I call the vote? Councillor Jeffrey, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through to the treasurer. I'm wondering if going forward in that long-term consideration, Marjorie, if it would include an updated BMA report that we could compare to our baseline.
Marjorie?
Through you, your worship. Yes, we can arrange with BMA to have one done. Yes.
Thank you.
We're just a little delayed. The way we're doing the audit this year is strange. So the audit and the FIR are just not quite there yet, but once we get the FIR done, they'll be able to get all the information.
Okay, thank you. And also, Mr. Mayor, if I might, through to the treasurer, I'm wondering in that if we would be considering, if you will, levels of project values. So pay as you go, as currently in our policy, would apply to certain projects under a certain value, and then there might be a little leeway with the big ones, because it seems to me that this policy has been working quite well, but there might be a need to have leeway for the larger ticket items. But I'll just comment before I ask the mayor to let you answer, is that I find when we didn't have this policy for pay-as-you-go, it's just really easy to just borrow the money and put it on the taxpayers going forward, as opposed to finding other sources to fund these. So I find this policy has really helped focus us on finding money other places.
Marjorie?
Through you, Your Worship, I would agree with Councillor Jeffrey that it has provided a direction and focus for council to do it. I would not I would not suggest that you eliminate it, because I know we're going to have to go into situations where we're going to have to borrow for $30 million for the wastewater treatment plant, those types of things. But and actually, I guess if we could get that working capital and the capital contingency reserves built back up, there may be more flexibility there anyway, because we would have those emergency type funds to draw on. But yeah, I think that looking at the level of the project in terms of whether it should be a pay-as-you-go and the priority and emergency nature of that project would be relevant to the pay-as-you-go.
Thank you.
Councillor McLeod?
Thank you, Your Worship. Just a point of clarification. In our agenda, it says that what we are going to be looking at here is that we will receive this report and approve the recommendations contained therein. I just want to be very clear what I'm voting on. The recommendations being that council direct staff to include consideration of a long-term debt position and asset management needs, including the special capital levy in the 2021 budget proposal to council. So what we're doing is we're including this information in the budget that we will start working on probably in late November or somewhere around there. Am I correct in this estimation?
Through you, Your Worship, yes, that's what it is. We need some baseline information if we're going to work on the budget, but I do think the work will start before November.
Of course. Thank you very much for that clarification.
Council, questions? Councillor Hamlin?
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor, to our treasurer. Did I hear you say that we have a $9 million infrastructure gap?
Marjorie?
Through you, Your Worship, yes, I would estimate. We're still in the estimation situation on that, because the original when we originally did the asset management plan, we actually included everything in it: the buildings, the water, the wastewater, land improvements for parks, and all of those things. And I believe that it is still somewhere around that number. However, when we're looking at what the requirements are for the asset management plan, we only have to include our core assets in the calculations until July 1st of 2021. Then by July 1st of 2023, our asset management plan has to incorporate all of the buildings and all of the vehicles and all of those things. So while we've been working on getting condition assessments for the water and wastewater, the roads, sidewalks, we have been putting in the vehicles. We've been getting the vehicles in the asset management plan. So there are other areas, like in terms of the wastewater treatment, there are really large components in there that we have to decide if, because through one of our systems, we can actually do the preventative maintenance plan on it in the system, and it will come up. So those are some of the areas that we're still working on. But I would believe if we took a look at all of our infrastructure in that way, it would still be at that approximate 9 million.
So I would say, to me, that is a good number. It seems much lower than what I was expecting. I don't know exactly. I had nothing to go on anything, but 9 million seems like a number we could work with. But,
Yes, through you, Your Worship, we have made a lot of inroads into that because we have carried on with our sewer renewal projects, and we've carried on and we've done water, and a lot of the roads have been done in that way. Like when we look at the condition of our roads, some people may say their roads not in very good condition, but the average condition of our roads in Collingwood is actually one up from good. I don't know what they have a classification for it, but it's actually one up from good. We have been spending money on that.
thank you. And I just have one further question through you, Mr. Mayor.
Go ahead.
There's an appendix to your report that compares Collingwood to various other municipalities with a population, it looks like, of under 30,000. I'm just wondering, to my mind, I always add in a population number to count our part-time residents. And in fact, I would say most of them are living here currently. And I know from speaking to our senior staff before this meeting some time ago, they would normally add about 25% onto our population to account for our part-time residents. So my question is, if we were comparing us to populations of 30 to 35,000, do you think our numbers would compare any differently? Or have you looked at that?
Through you, Worship, I have not looked at that, but I could take a quick look tomorrow and see, because the next step up, though, I think is it's larger than that. I got to feel, yeah, it's 30 to 50,000, I think is the next, but I can check and put that out tomorrow.
Okay, thanks so much. Thank you.
Council, any questions? Marjorie, I just wanted to follow up on one point. I know Councillor Jeffrey's already raised the BMA, and we've been using those comparator reports, I think, going back to 2015 or late 2014. And it's my recollection that the financial position is kind of the overall balancing between your debts and your assets and your liabilities. And I think in around 2016 or 2017, we made the leap from being in a net deficit position to being in a net positive position. And do you have any idea what that position is today?
To you, Your Worship, we have I have not seen the second draft of the financial statements or audited financial statements, and I just don't have that number at my fingertips. So it is possible that I can get it tomorrow. The auditors have had one go through on it, but I can get a copy of that tomorrow and let you know.
Okay, that would be helpful. Thank you. All right, if there's no other questions, then I will call the vote. All in favor? And that is carried unanimously. And I think, Marjorie, that might be it for you. Thank you.
Just for now, Your Worship. I'll be back.
You'll be back, will you? Okay. So next we have item 4.4, CCS 2020-4, the Climate Change and Green Initiatives report back. I will pass this over to Director Culver, Executive Director Culver. Hi, Dean.
Hi. So I'll be brief. This is a very large report, obviously, and I hope the council committee had a chance to read through it. I think I'd like to start by saying this was an inherited project started by CAO Skinner before she transitioned to the new role. And she had done an immense amount of work along with Michelle Blanchet on collecting information. You should be grateful to know that I trimmed it from 15 pages down to 8 pages. You're welcome. And but it's also a report that I'm really, really happy about because it does, I think, tie together a lot of what council has indicated to be their interests over the term of this council. In the purpose and section, you'll see a number of motions and requests, and I honestly don't think that's all of them. I think it's all the motions, but I think that there were a ton more requests, and I definitely know there were a lot more inquiries from individual council members surrounding initiatives towards greening of Collingwood and climate change. I think it also is a good response to the community interest that showed up in terms of climate change rallies that were presented by youth, the formation of the Collingwood Climate Action Team, and other broad community interests that have told us that the town of Collingwood wants to be a champion for climate change response. Within the recommendations, you'll see a couple things, and I'm gonna own up to at least one thing, and that is that the recommendation number one, asking us to join the Federation of Canadian Municipalities Partners for Climate Protection. We've already done that. It was free, so we took the initiative and did it. So we hope that you support it. I'm sure you will. But I wanted to become clean that we're already involved in that program. But I think if we boil it down to the finish line, really, this is a larger program overall than we have the capacity to serve properly. And I think that's sort of what the story that's being told through this report. Obviously, you guys all have a strong interest in Collingwood being a champion for green initiatives and climate change. Certainly staff have shown through the formation of the Greener Collingwood Group that they have an interest as well. The community has told us repeatedly through actions and comments and demands, actually, that they would like to see more. But we're really at our maximum capacity and need to have some support, some resource support in moving forward. So, so we're eager to get going. I think we know you are as well. Department heads had a good conversation about how best to present this. And at the end of the day, we recognize that across the organization, there are resource demands that are not necessarily being met right now. So we've put it to you that resource is needed. We've indicated that it could be brought to you through a budget response or a budget recommendation, but we'll leave it in your capable hands to tell us what you'd like to see happen. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to hear it.
Thank you, Dean. I know we have some of our, or at least one of our members of our local climate action team, Nick Clayton, in the audience, and I don't know if Nick or anyone else in the audience wants to speak to this report before I put it on the floor for council.
Yes, Your Worship, it looks like Nick would like to speak, so we will allow him to talk.
Greetings, Council, and
Hi.
the Mayor, Saunderson.
Hi, Nick. How are you?
Great, thanks. I will be brief too. Thank you, Executive Director Culver. I read the report. So much to be happy about, as with all things coming out of this council when it comes to the environment. Just speaking on behalf of the Collingwood Climate Action Team, we're very excited to have a climate action plan in place because that provides a framework. And when we frame our efforts, it helps us work more effectively towards these shared goals that we have. I've been a big proponent of FCM, PCP. I think it's an essential, and I can see Councillor Jeffrey there agrees with me. And I think it's just essential because the milestone framework provides that layer of accountability and transparency. And it allows us to measure our efforts. And when we measure our efforts, we're able to communicate those efforts more clearly for informed policymaking, and also to communicate effectively to the public about the progress we're making. And I don't think you can really say you're having a net positive effect unless you set that baseline and take measurements and report back, reflect. So being in that initiative, I think is a very, very positive step. And like Executive Director Culver said, it's free. So why not? I have a question. The report states there will be one corporate staff member and one elected official appointed as sort of points of contact. am I correct in assuming that would be Councillor Jeffrey and the CAO Skinner, or?
I'll put that through to Dean or the CAO. Who would like to take that question?
That actually sounds to me like a governance question.
Yes, I think it is.
So perhaps
Sonia,
I
go
guess.
ahead.
Thank you, through you, Your Worship. We hadn't actually talked yet about who would be the best representative to act on this, and I think both Executive Director Culver and myself, from a staff perspective, are very interested. And at the immediate time, he has that staff leadership role. And certainly we hadn't structured the report today to make it easy for you to nominate a potential council member to work with us and how that might work. So I'm thinking that while I'm quite interested in people expressing interest, how to move forward with that is not something we've yet contemplated. Thank you.
Nick, anything else? Any follow-up?
No, that's excellent. I just look forward to seeing who those people are going to be. So again, we have that framework to work within and know who we're going to be working with. One last point to make for me is just also I really liked seeing that there was going to be it was considered a recommendation, which I highly support. I'm sure the group will, of having a point person or hiring a contract staff member to head up these green initiatives and procure funding and grants. Would I be right in assuming that a position like that is a value added or a good value proposition, because a salaried position like that would be bringing in grants, and I'm assuming there will be federal money coming in line with a just recovery or green recovery, because the federal government has indicated that is forthcoming. So am I right in assuming that a position like that, a contract position, would actually be of more very cost effective, because it would bring in more possibly money in terms of grants and funding than it would cost the town to pay that salary position?
Dean, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, through you, Your Worship. That's absolutely one of the objectives of the hire, is to have them seek out grant funding. I wouldn't want to make promises about whether they'll, offset their own expenses, but I think that definitely would be a goal we'd shoot for, offsetting and beyond. So, yes.
Thanks, Dean.
That's it for me. I look very much forward to working with you all, and Collingwood's just making great strides in its committed pursuit of Sustainable Development Goal 11, UN, and it's very heartening to be part of such a caring community under such responsible leadership. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Nick, and congratulations to you and your action team for all the work you've done so far, and hopefully we will be working together as we move forward on all of this.
Feelings very mutual. Thank you.
Good. Sarah, is anyone else from the gallery want to speak on this issue?
It does not look like there's any further interest to speak on this matter.
Okay, then I'll put the motion on the floor, the recommendation. That's CCS 2020-4 Climate Change and Green Initiatives Report. It's moved by Councillor Doherty and seconded by Councillor Berman. That staff report CCS 2020-4 be received, and council directs staff to join the Federation of Canadian Municipalities Partners for Climate Protection PCP program, which consists of a 5-step milestone framework. That council directs staff to continue with existing measures and actions regarding corporate green initiatives and climate change response. The council directs staff to visibly indicate on staff reports when a report may have positive implications for corporate green initiatives or as a positive contribution towards the fight against climate change. And the council directs staff to include the acquisition of a qualified part-time contract staff to support corporate green initiatives and achieve objectives and expected deliverables over a three-year time frame within the 2021 budget proposal to council. Council, questions or comments? Councillor McLeod.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just again, a point of clarification on the direction that we are giving. This does not commit us if we say yes to this recommendation to to hiring this 3-year part-time person come budget days. Does it or does it?
No, it wouldn't. It would be subject to budget discussions and deliberations, but I will look to Executive Director Culver to confirm that.
No, this doesn't commit council to that hire at this time. In fact, I would say that the spirited debate or discussion at department heads was that there are a lot of needs in the community or needs in the organization for staffing, and so it would be best if council was able to look at it in a fuller picture and make decisions. But I will say, I think it's very fair and safe to say that we'll struggle to achieve some of these objectives that are outlined in the report without an additional resource. But again, you're not committing to that today.
Thank you for the clarification.
Councillor Doherty, I saw your hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. And through you to Acting Executive Director Culver, it is so gratifying to see in this report what we have achieved and what we are in process of achieving. Very affirmative action, and I look very much forward to see some of the deliverables that are going to come out of some of these initiatives. I also had a question in regard to the recommendation of a staff hire to implement some of these recommendations. Do you envision that this could be seconded or half seconded from another existing role within the municipality?
Ian?
So through you, Mayor Saunderson, I'll be honest with you, I don't think so. I think that there's somewhat of an expertise required here. We have, and I think it's a very narrow field. We've had lots of conversations about the kind of applicant that would be successful in this role. And I think it is somewhat specific. I also think too that, and I think it's really important for council to understand that we're fighting through probably the hardest time, well, definitely in the history of our organization, as anybody who's been in our organization for the longest period of time. Resources were maxed out and at a premium before COVID, and now we're struggling even more. We've done redeployments where we can within the COVID timeframe to sort of try and move through the COVID timeframe, but really secondments mean that somebody doesn't have a full workload where they are. And so my suggestion is that it's not likely that we'll find that within our organization, not the expertise required notwithstanding.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Councillor Doherty. Councillor Comey.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Executive Director Culver. Then just for a final point of clarification on this thread, then just for memory's sake, at budget time, will we see this from PRC as a supplemental line item, or I apologize, I'm not sure what department we'll see this from. Will this be considered a supplemental, or is it going to be embedded in the budget? Because sometimes I just have a hard time remembering.
Executive Director.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question and very fair. The budget document is obviously very thick, and I can understand why it's difficult to sort of pull out initiatives at the time where we're reviewing budget. I don't know how it's going to be presented, to be perfectly honest with you. I think what we've talked about at department heads is having it presented in the context of staff overall. But I see Marjorie wanting to comment, and I'm positive she'll have a good constructive comment to add.
Through you, Your Worship. Through you, Your Worship. I believe that any staff request is going to be shown as a service enhancement, unless it will cut current overtime that staff are working. There's a difference that if you can have people that are working tons of overtime, which my staff still are, until we can get our contract financial analyst, the overtime that my staff work will pay for the person that I'm going to hire for that position. So unless this is something along those lines, it'll be shown as a service enhancement.
Yeah, and through you, Your Worship, I think actually our policy is always to show service enhancements as separate initiatives within the budget as well. And this would definitely be a service enhancement. We'd be increasing our scope of services with this.
Okay, that's great. Then I don't have to save a file or something. Thank you so much for that clarification.
Councillor Jeffrey.
Thank you, Mayor Saunderson. Just briefly, I'd like to thank Nick for covering all my material,
Yeah.
including the case that, which I think is important and worth repeating, is that having those baselines and hitting those milestones puts us in such a better place for green infrastructure funding, particularly through the Green Municipal Fund at FCM. And that's it.
Thank you. Councillor Hamlin, you had your card up.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just really had two comments. One was, of course, always subject to bottom line budget discussions, but I'm very excited about the prospect of having a person hired on a part-time basis to make sure that we have some real corporate focus on these kind of initiatives. I know a young person in another municipality who has this kind of a role, and they have a master's degree in environmental science, and it's a whole different perspective than I would have, for example. And I think it would really allow us to get to the next level in our environmental actions. And secondly, I also just wanted to point out that I thought it was great that staff suggesting that they'll visibly indicate on the staff reports when their recommendations will have a positive impact on our green initiatives. So I will be supporting this for sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, this has been an extremely in-depth report, and as a result of a lot of man hours of labor, both by our CAO and our executive director. And this is an exciting initiative and one that we've been working forward to, and one that's extremely timely and necessary. So I will certainly be supporting it as we work forward on this front. With that being said, then I will call the vote. All in favor? And that is carried unanimously, I think, but we may have just lost. Oh no, there he is. Do we lose someone? No, okay, good. Dean just checked out. All right, that takes us then to the consent agenda, and it is moved by Councillor Berman and seconded by Councillor Jeffrey that the general consent agenda, having been given due consideration by the standing committee, be received. And there are 7 items. 5.1, Town of Bracebridge, establishment of a municipal financial assistance program. 5.2, Town of Kingsville, expansion of provincial rent assistance program. 5.3, Town of Renfrew, fast tracking of investing in Canada infrastructure program grant applications. 5.4, various businesses and residents of Simcoe County just recovery from COVID-19. 5.5, Simcoe Muskoka District Health Unit, basic income for income security during COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. 5.6, Simcoe Muskoka District Health Unit council meetings for during phase 3. And 5.7, Ethnic Mosaic Alliance, read letter of interest to support a multicultural center in Collingwood. So first I'll call vote to adopt the agenda, and then I'll ask council if they want to pull any items. So first, receiving the report, all in favor? And that is carried unanimously. And council, are there any items you'd like to pull? I've got a number. So first we'll start with Councillor McLeod.
5.4 and 5.5, please.
Councillor Comey.
5.3, please, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Doherty.
Thank you. I was also going to ask for 5.4, but I will add 5.7, please.
Okay. And Councillor Hamlin.
Sorry, also 5.7. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to go numerically then, starting with 5.3, Town of Renfrew, fast tracking of investing in Canada infrastructure program grant applications.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is a letter, and I give full acknowledgement that perhaps Executive Director Culver didn't have a chance to have a peek at it, but it's an ICIP, it's in reference to the ICIP grants, which I believe this is the reference, the same ones that we've applied to for the Fisher Field Super Deluxe Clubhouse Extraordinaire. And the Town of Renfrew is saying, Whereas the County of Renfrew and the other 19 municipalities and First Nation reserves have submitted over 73.5 million worth of applications to the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program, Community, Culture, and Recreation Stream, with all considered shovel-ready, worthy projects. And what they go on to say is they call upon the Government of Ontario and Canada to fast-track the review of current and previous ICIP grant applications in order to provide much needed employment and investment into Ontario to provide sustainable infrastructure. And so my thought here is that in Executive Director Culver, through you, Mr. Mayor, can correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, this particular grant we applied to was back on November 12th. We just talked about it on Monday that we're in a holding pattern. We have this wonderful shovel-ready project and we are stuck waiting. And if this is the same flavor of grant application we applied, I would be very much in support of us sending a similar letter so we can see where we stand and get some of these projects going.
Executive Director Culver.
Yeah, through you, Your Worship, it is the same base grant, ICIP. It's a different stream of the grant is all, but certainly I'm not opposed to fast tracking. We are waiting. Certainly understand that in the current situation globally why there've been delays, but the sooner we get the answer on which way we can go with the funding, the sooner we'll be able to start making something happen at Fisher Field. So I don't have any concerns with council if they wish to do the same.
Thank you, Executive Director Culver. And this was a motion, so I will look to Clerk Almas. What would be the best way to get this on the floor, or is it a notice of motion that will be dealt with at the next meeting? Give us some advice there, please, Sarah.
Certainly, through your worship. Items requiring further direction from members of council, notice 24 hours in advance of the meeting is required. So right now it would be considered a notice of motion to be considered at the next meeting.
Okay. Councillor Comey, would you like to put a notice of motion on the floor?
Yes, please. And I'll sort of wing it on the fly because as Executive Director Culver pointed out, Mr. Mayor, it's a slightly different stream of the same ICIP grant. So it would be, I suppose, for the town of Collingwood to send a letter requesting fast tracking of ICIP grant application status. Perhaps Clerk Almas and I can tweak that a little bit, the flavor of which is contained here from the city of Renfrew.
Okay, so we've got that read in, and we'll leave it to you to connect with Clerk Almas to finalize the wording on that.
Thank you so much.
5.4, various businesses and residents of Simcoe County just recovery from COVID-19. Who asked for that one to be pulled? Councillor McLeod.
Thank you. I also asked for 5.5 to be pulled, and they do seem to be rather connected. And thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to bring attention to these two items because they do really seem to be somewhat related to the situation we find ourselves in as a society and a world right now. And I think that people have said, I think it's an old curse, that a crisis is an opportunity. The flip side of crisis is opportunity. And one of the things that I've been having conversations about during the last several months of COVID is not that adversity builds character, but that it reveals it. And I think we have an opportunity as a country to reveal our character. We have universal health care and we look after people. And I think that if we could also, as our as the Simcoe Muskokas District Health Unit has suggested, or as is suggested, from the health unit, that if we could encourage our federal government to consider a universal basic income, that it would provide resilience for many people across this country. And so I will be bringing a notice of motion which sort of encapsulates the sentiments carried within these two items on the consent agenda. I could do that now, or I can bring it during other business. It is at your discretion, obviously.
No, I think as I understand the intent of your notice is to bring a motion to ask the federal government, and there was a provincial pilot project with the last Wynne government, so I don't know if you want to go after both levels of government to implement a guaranteed income supplement program. So if does that capture the thrust?
Oh, I have it written out.
Oh, okay. Well, then go ahead.
So my notice of motion reads as follows. Whereas the council, the corporation of the town of Collingwood has received correspondence from Anita Dubois, Chair, Board of Health, Simcoe Muskoka District Health Unit, dated May 20, 2020, regarding basic income for income security during COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. Whereas to help reduce the financial strain on its citizens and businesses during the COVID-19 pandemic, the town of Collingwood has approved disbursement of funds to local food banks and redirection of municipal funds to providing temporary tax relief to residents in crisis. And whereas current research into universal basic income has shown potential to improve individual physical and mental health, labor market participation, food security, housing stability, financial status, and social relationships, and generally raise the standard of living for vulnerable members of society, therefore be it resolved that Collingwood Town Council supports the Simcoe Muskoka District Health Unit's call to the federal government for the evolution of the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, CERB, into a universal basic income for all Canadians, and that this resolution be forwarded to the Right Honourable Prime Minister, the Honourable Premier, the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, local MPPs and MPs, the County of Simcoe, and municipalities across the province of Ontario.
Very good. So we've got that read into the record, and thank you for that. Now, Councillor Doherty, I know you had pulled one of those items as well. Did you want to speak to the matter as well?
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. Really, I just wanted to congratulate this group of very diverse community interest groups who have put together such a thoughtful and thorough analysis of the opportunities that have arisen because of this COVID-19 emergency, social opportunities, economic and environmental. And I also, it seemed to me that a lot of these recommendations actually were incorporated in the UN Sustainable Development Goal 11, in which we are participating as a demonstration municipality. And I was just wondering if you or CAO Skinner would care to just elaborate on some of the things that we are doing or will be doing that follow along the same lines.
I will pick it up and then I will pass it to Executive Director, CAO Skinner. We did have a meeting last week for the World Summit, the upcoming World Summit, and it was, I think, a very productive meeting. We are working closely with the steering committee, and I think the CAO and I had planned to give a more thorough report back to council, maybe at a subsequent meeting in July, to make sure that everyone's up to date on the initiative and what it entails. And so I think for today, given our length of our agenda, that we're going to push it forward, but we will certainly be providing a much more in-depth report to council on that initiative. Sonia, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just that it has been decided that the initial conference, which was intended to be in Collingwood on the 1st and 2nd of September, has been moved to a virtual platform. And we're still working out the how that will work and some of the other details that we'll tell you more about at shortly upcoming meeting.
Thank you, Sonia. And the last item we had was, go ahead, Councillor Doherty.
Actually, I was just jumping ahead to that, Your Worship. Item 5.7, the Ethnic Mosaic Alliance, which is a letter which has been sent to us to support a multicultural center in Collingwood. And I was intrigued by this proposition, and I was wondering what we knew further about this. As an example, could such a center include what we would consider to be a more, word I'm looking for, commonly understood community center. So I'm just throwing it out here, like Peter Collingwood as an example, to become a partner in something like that. Also, if we knew whether they were entertaining or would entertain a private investment component.
The letter did come into Town Hall, so I'm going to look to CAO Skinner to address that.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you to Councillor Doherty. I don't know a lot about the letter. I had reached out to Mark Aiken because it talks about a collaboration, who's the CAO, of course, of Simcoe County, because the letter talks about a collaboration through the county, just to see if in fact the funding had been committed, the amount of momentum and support perhaps that were behind this group, because I personally have not heard of the group before. I'm not quite sure if they've been around a long time or a short time and how large they are. If there is interest in finding out more, then we could do that upon the instruction of council. We were a little concerned about the time frame, which is why we wanted to get it on this agenda, even though we hadn't, well, we get it on the agenda when it comes in, but we haven't gotten all the facts, and the time frame is relatively short. I believe it's August 10th in the letter itself that they're asking for the municipality to indicate interest. And I do think it seems as though the writer is looking for collaboration potentially among community groups or, you know, other interested parties across municipalities and the other sectors. Thank you.
Councillor Doherty, did you want to?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I actually had addressed a note to the author of that letter, but I hadn't heard anything back yet. So if I hear anything, I will also convey it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I think that concludes all the items in the consent agenda. Go ahead, Councillor Hamlin.
I had also, excuse me, Mr. Mayor, wanted to talk to that item 5.7.
Okay, go ahead.
So I found this to be a very, exciting opportunity for Collingwood. And I was wondering if I would be very much in favor of seeing if we could get this onto a subsequent agenda with a staff report that would indicate whether this would be worthwhile us filing a letter of interest and an intent of interest, I guess, and the deadline being August the 10th. I see this as an opportunity for us to demonstrate our commitment to our multicultural community, and it may in fact help our employers who are always seeking employees from a broad spectrum of our talent pool. I noticed that the intention is very much community center, and I was very excited to see that because, we can't have too much of that. I noticed, of course, to my eye, the big item being that they're looking for land to be donated. And, it may be something we could also think about whether there would be land privately owned that could be made available for this. So there is a lot of thinking to be done, but I would be grateful if we could somehow get this a staff report with whatever information could be gleaned in the time available, with a view to seeing whether it's worthwhile getting in a letter of intent.
Okay, so staff report's going to require some resources, and I know we've been asking for a heads up on that. I'm wondering if we could ask CAO Skinner, based on what we've heard from Councillor Doherty as well about reaching out to the author, if we can get some additional background information, and then maybe bring that back to council for a determination on how we're going to proceed, and if we're looking at I'm not sure if we have really time for a staff report given the August 10th deadline, and we don't have meetings into August. So I would look to CAO Skinner for some input on what you think would be the best way to look into this.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think that the best, I am very conscious of resources. I think that it would be fair to look into this and see what we can find as far as immediately available information to bring back to our next meeting opportunity in July. And we can make a recommendation at that point on how exciting it is and how we may or may not be able to proceed. But I wouldn't want to say stop right now. And I wouldn't want to commit to a staff report. So I really like that middle ground of let's see if it excites us once we know a little bit more.
Yeah.
Okay. I see Councillors Hamlin and Doherty nodding, so that's acceptable. Okay, then CEO Skinner, I think if you could proceed in that way, that would be great. And I think, have I missed anyone then on the consent agenda, or is that the full items? Okay, so now we get into departmental updates. Section 6, and item 6.1 is seek council's input on options and approach for asset sale proceeds decision, and I will pass it over to CAO Skinner.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. We haven't talked about the approach or the intentions for the asset sale proceeds for a while. And one of the councillors or the councillor and the mayor had asked me about how this will come back to the table. And I thought it was worthwhile having this discussion today. The intention is not that we would walk away necessarily, or we're not asking for a motion. But looking at the range of inputs that are provided by council members and should be considered in staff in the development of the reports that you will receive next. And also to help set mutually consistent expectations between council and staff on how this will roll out. This is a very important decision. And these funds were in place when council took office, and I know that there is an intention articulated to make a decision on this during this mandate of council, and it is also contained in our strategic plan to do so. So on slide 3, there's a little bit of background. There's about 17 million, yay, $480,000 available. And you would have seen in the financial reports from the treasurer earlier that was about $200,000 higher, but we did use some of the funds this year for, I believe, some parks related work at the time of the 2020 budget. So we can do a lot of things with this funding. I didn't say in my bullet points that we could just spend it on small things, but we could. But I'm hoping that will support the town's fiscal responsibility and sustainability, and potentially also enable otherwise unattainable legacy project or two. In looking at this, I really think that the criteria we'd be looking at in a staff report are projects that significantly contribute toward our town vision, following the strategic plan and the master plans, that are tangible, publicly useful, and enduring. So slide 4 talks about the initial staff starting point. So this is just a reminder, nothing new in this slide whatsoever. But in February of this year, you received a report that was really a kickoff saying, here's a list of things that staff think might be the right way to spend the asset sale proceeds. And those options included paying down the tax supported internal debt, which is sitting at around, at the time, 3.3 million. So that's where we are loaning it between departments, as Marjorie was explaining earlier, relatively low interest rate. Collingwood terminals, up to 10 million. Various projects, the 3 noted, were extending services to the Spit, the terminals area, and the yacht clubs. Property in the downtown or the waterfront areas, and staff accommodation. And we were looking at the time at the 10th line, which was a full renewal with more space for vehicles and equipment and staff change rooms and the like to enable a number of more years at that spot. An internal loan fund, reserves, including addressing the asset management gap or portions of it, and the legacy funds. So there's two options that were mentioned in that initial report. One was a broader community foundation, and the second was a legacy fund investment just for town initiatives. So in that last bullet point, you would never spend the capital. You would simply spend the interest or earnings on those funds in perpetuity on projects for either the broader community or I guess council's priorities in the legacy fund investment. On slide 5, the Treasury Finance Department led a public consultation so that we could get public input into the survey, the asset sale proceeds. And there were 761 people who responded. And the numbers following each bullet point are how many people had recommended using each of these options. This is straight out of the report as well. Nothing new here that you didn't see in November of last year. So there was paying down the debt, which is happening in any case. Investing in the terminals, waterfront, and I put these in descending order of the number of people who supported them. The waterfront master plan, reserve fund, hospital reserve fund, supporting arts, culture, and theater, extending services to the spit, establishing an internal loan fund, and property in or near the downtown core. And then of course there were a number of other recommendations that sort of fall off from there and they're in the report. Some of these, depending on how you look at them, could be grouped. Like if you look at the terminals and extending services to the spit, for example, they would add up to 361 votes, which would put them, you know, even nearer the top of the list. And then there's another one about the waterfront master plan, which would push some of the work at, you know, terminals and spits higher on the list as well. On the next slide, it just talks about new input. So since those two reports, if we look through the strategic plan and what's happened to us, other options have been the notional commitment of some amount up to 2.5 million to a COVID recovery fund. And in the strategic plan, the property or land item was expanded from waterfront and downtown to include potential other green spaces, green interconnectivity, and future town facilities, whether that be a multiplex or something else. So that's the long list of all of the potential investments that are currently to date on the table. And we're going to ask you, not right now, but at the end of the presentation, if that long list is the list that covers council's interests. Slide 7 talks about now the approach for the decision. So you can always know more. This approach A is the learn more first approach. So we're still looking at within this council's mandate, but the idea here is that we would have a community foundation report back, the grain terminals report back, our 2021 budget where we would learn a bit more about our asset management plans and how we can meet our asset needs with an adjustment to the capital levy or not. And then there's other things that could happen subsequent even to that going into 2021, things like the rest of the grain terminals information. The first report back probably won't finalize the funding. For example, if we went to an RFP or a design competition, or for that matter, even went to a contract for the removal of the terminals, all of those would have different financial commitments that we wouldn't know until we'd taken the second step. The Arts Center feasibility study will report back. Executive Director Culver mentioned at the CCS committee earlier this week that we need to take another look at the staff accommodation study, for example, which had previously had about $20 million of investments over the next 15 or so years. So this option really says later in 2021, when we've got a better handle on some of those big picture items, we would decide how to allocate the asset sale proceeds. On the next slide, is another option. I've called it approach B. So that one basically says we're really close to a report back on a community foundation and the initial report back on the grain terminals, which will be followed very quickly before November, I hope. Maybe it'd be November, December before you decide, but the overall budget for 2021 with that more refined asset management and capital levy items in it, at which time you could then subsequently in December or possibly January, because we'll be busy on our agendas on what to do with the asset sale proceeds. And I guess there's always other options that accelerate even before that. But these are the two that I think are reasonable for starting positions. So that's the end of the update. The last slide really asks you the two questions that this is meant to do, to have a very positive conversation between all the members about your thoughts on these two questions. Are the potential expenditures listed in this presentation those that you would like to further continue and consider? Happy to have any deleted or added. And do you prefer one of these two approaches to making a decision on the capital asset funds? And with that, I'll turn it back to the chair, Mayor Saunderson, for the discussion.
Thank you, Sonia. And given that this is a big public interest item, I will ask Sarah to see if there's anyone in the gallery that would like to comment on the presentation we've just received before I put it on the floor for council.
Again, I will ask through your worship if there's any attendees wishing to speak to this matter. And at this point, there's no interest to comment on this report.
All right, then I will look to council. Council questions, comments. Councillor McLeod.
Yes, I'm doing this again, clarifying what it is that we're voting on. So I'm looking at the slides and I see 6 things listed in one of the, in slide number 4. The options included paying down tax supported internal debt, the terminals, these projects, the internal loan fund, reserves and legacies. Is that what we're looking at today? Or potentially limiting ourselves to when you say, is this the list? Through you, Mr. Mayor, to the acting CIO.
Okay, I think we're opening the discussion and inviting any additional ideas, but I'll pass it over to Sonia.
You're going to need to turn your mic on.
Thought I did that, but thank you. Yes, what I'm looking for is your input on slides 4, 5, and 6 about whether these are the list of items that you would like to have further considered. However, unless the SIC would like to put a motion on the table, there is no motion proposed. What we're doing is gathering information for a staff report. So I don't think that it will definitively take anything off the table, but it will allow us to provide a report that has been transparently and well considered using the public input of council.
Thank you.
Any other questions, council? Oh, Councillor Doherty, did you have your card up?
Thank you, I did, but I was more prepared to comment on slides 7 and 8 in terms of the go forward approach.
That's fine.
But you're not.
No, go ahead.
Excuse me. So I guess I'm leaning toward the approach A for a decision. I'm generally in agreement with the list that has been compiled both by council and by members of the public when we went out initially and surveyed for desire for use of funds. But what I like about the approach A is that we're going to take a little bit longer to get some important and hopefully quantified information relative to potential use for the grain terminals, feasibility of the art center, etc. I think that this information is so important to have, and this expenditure so critical, that I wouldn't want to make any decisions until I had that kind of information in front of me. So leaning toward the more longer term, or slightly more delayed, but more robust consideration of future impacts before we make the decision.
Okay, so I'm not going to look for a sec. Can I take it then, Councillor Doherty, that you're putting option A on the table?
Yes, I am, but I'm really soliciting for feedback, or soliciting because feedback has been asked.
Right, and I appreciate that. Yeah. So I'm not going to ask for a seconder yet. I'm going to continue the discussion, and then when we've had that, I'll come back to you. Okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Councillor Jeffrey.
Thank you, Mayor Saunderson. I think option A would be a luxury. I kind of go in between A and B. The closer we get to 2022, it seems, whether we like it or not, the closer you get to an election year, the more crazy the discussions go on in terms of spending money or allocating money, if you will. So for me, I think in terms of us being able to have the healthy discussion, and somewhere between B and A might work better. But I think the list is pretty all-inclusive. 17.8 million sounds like a lot of money. If you look at that list, it's not. And we're going to have to make some tough decisions within that list.
Any other questions or comments, Council? Go ahead, Councillor Hamlin.
I'm satisfied with the list for the proceeds. I think the last one that was added, which was the property item, expanded to include green spaces, interconnectivity, and future town facilities, opens things up a lot more in my mind, and really makes the list, agreeable to me. And also I'm happy for approach A for the reasons that Councillor Doherty gave.
Thank you. Councillor Comey.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would echo the comments of Councillor Doherty. I think it's a substantial amount of money. And the more information, the better type of person. If I interpreted that slide correct to me, and through you, Mr. Mayor, perhaps CEO Skinner can walk through some of those finer points a little more fully so I can understand them. I think there was a little more fuller look at the terminals and some additional information, I think engineering reports that had been requested early on. So that's how I was interpreting A. I saw the arts feasibility study, which I remember council supporting. I lean towards that. Overall, just as a comment I would offer, I've always been surprised at how low a response I consider we got from our residents in terms of usage. Is about 700 or so respondents. I think, we got a much larger response when it came to cannabis. So I take it we're at a runway to go back to the public, but I mean, based on what we have, we'll work with it. There's nothing at this time I would add to that list. But looking back on it, I think it's worthy of consideration why that turnout was fairly low in terms of response from our residents, but we'll have to work with what we have. But long story short, I would be in favor of a slow and methodical approach to how we're going to spend this, with faith that our council would not act in any other way but good faith with this exercise, not swayed by any political motivation. So I thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? I think Councillor Jeffrey had to step out. Councillor McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm in support also of option A. It's only 6 months, and I think whether what Councillor Jeffrey, and I am loath to speak to what she had to say without her at the table. But I think whether the discussion gets crazy during an election year will be up to us. And so let's commit not to get crazy during that. And so I will be supporting that we stick with the list and go with option A.
Okay, thank you. I know Councillor Jeffrey's not here, but I think she was referring more to if you get too backed up into the term, you become lame duck. So she was concerned about making significant financial decisions too close to the election.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other comments then? I know Councillor Doherty has put option A on the floor, and unless there's any other comments, I will look for a seconder. Anyone other to second option A? I've got Councillor McLeod. And so this is a very big initiative for us. This is you don't sell assets very often, and they are in my when you get the benefit of those, the sale of those, you need to invest them in the best interest of the community, and these are big decisions. So I'm certainly in favor of option A and taking the time to make sure we have the best available evidence before we make our decisions on this very significant legacy fund. So with that being said, I'm going to call the vote for option A, which is to learn more first. All in favor? Opposed? Duly noted. All right. And that brings us to item 6.2, economic support and recovery, recommendation update. CAO Skinner.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. I actually have Martin Ridlow on the line, and there he is. He's going to run us through the many things that have happened since the task force. You provided direction on the task force's recommendations about a month or so ago.
Yes. Welcome, Martin. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mayor Saunderson, members of council. I just want to give you a brief update in terms of where we're at in terms of the task force recommendations. If I can draw your attention to the website page where we actually have all those summarized, it is at www.collingwood.ca/taskforce. And that can act as a helpful guide for all the great recommendations that they provided us with. I'm just going to quickly step through them, and so if there are any questions at the end, happy to answer them. This is more of a update rather than a more detailed discussion on any of the specific items. Let me begin with item number 1, which relates to economic impact metrics. We are well on our way to be able to present our first dashboard this month, and the numbers are coming in relatively well, actually. In terms of business support and recovery services, as you may have seen, we have launched the new 7-step checklist that is available at www.collingwood.ca/recovery, and it makes it super easy for businesses to understand what are the core things they need to be doing. And that's certainly something that we heard was a major challenge for businesses. We have radio, videos, social media campaigns launching this week to promote this, as well as the new $2,500 Digital Main Street grant available to businesses through the expanded service squad. And that was just announced in the Collingwood.business newsletter that you all receive as well. So we're certainly getting that great news out. Under number 3, business and tourism relaunch marketing, our shop local video series has launched through the South Georgian Bay Tourism Association. That is, of course, part of the recovery and resiliency plan that was approved last month. And we'll see more of that recovery and resiliency plan rolling out over the next few weeks. This includes the Shop Safely poster that was developed by the Tourism Association in an effort to try and create a consistent message for shoppers in the region in terms of what are the 6 key behaviors that we are hoping that they follow. It's meant to be a guideline, and as such, we're just making sure that all of the municipalities are aware of its intent as a guideline. It's not something that is a set of mandated activities. It is meant to be a gentle encouragement for people shopping to make sure that they follow the guidelines set out. And it's something that's actually been done in cooperation with Blue Mountain Resort as well as the Blue Mountain Village Association. So I just want to make sure we share this with council so you're aware of this. And we'll be following up with them to endorse the use of the municipality's logo on it, as are all of the other representatives within the Tourism Association as they go back to their respective CAOs and councils to just make sure everyone's aware of what's happening there. The Collingwood remarketing campaign is coming along well. We have assembled a group of marketing experts from Collingwood that are, if you will, working very much as advisors on a volunteer basis at this point to help set up a brief, and we'll be following up with council shortly on that. And finally, we have begun our business outreach program, calling businesses with some of our existing staff. And we are going to be posting the new small business advisor position next week so that we can further expand our support and recovery services at the Business Development Center. Number 4, relaunch events. The Canada Day porch parties and the Peak to Shore virtual celebration went really well. We really stood out in terms of some of the major municipalities that were doing virtual events on Canada Day. And it's a great example of collaboration between Collingwood and the Blue Mountains, as well as the local businesses. As a follow-up to the town's social media channels and the commitment to put on virtual concerts, please do follow our social media channels. There are concerts there. There are performances. It is really admirable what the PRC team has been able to assemble to deliver on the specific recommendations of the task force. The virtual downtown discovery tours are going to be talked about today under item 6.5 as part of the Main Street modernization project. And last but not least, under this one, we're working on downtown street closure pilots. And that's once again something that we'll be talking about some more today. As you've seen, the work that has been done to allow patios to be on streets has had a resounding response with some very unique, amazing patios already out there dotting downtown Collingwood. The Shop Local incentive, as you'll recall, Council authorized getting a consultant to provide a more detailed plan and feasibility review. I'm just top lining their findings, knowing that we need to come back to Council with some more details. But quickly, they do believe it is feasible, but no earlier than the end of September. And that would require immediate dedication of significant resources. There certainly can be financial benefit, but they feel the biggest benefit is actually going to be more of an emotional community engagement initiative, which was good to note. This consultant has had extensive experience in points and rewards programs at Chapters Indigo, American Express, so they can certainly speak from a point of expertise. And they did suggest that there may be some lower risk opportunities to explore and deliver on the same objective. And that is exactly what we're evaluating and discussing with staff over the next few days so that we can come back to Council in the coming weeks in terms of what to do here. And last but not least, under supporting social services, the roundtable continues to be a source of collaboration, as is the weekly meetings that we do have set up around PPE resource availability. And that has, of course, become even more important given this week's announcement around the requirement of having face protection in indoor public spaces. And that wraps it up for today's update on the task force recommendations.
Go ahead, Sonia.
Just wanted to mention briefly that Martin said as he was speaking that there's a document that was being put up in our businesses about how each person can act responsibly. And that's the document that we would like and are intending to put the Collingwood logo on. And we're hoping some other municipalities will as well. And will be consistent across all the municipalities. So if you see it out there with our logo on it, you'll have seen it first here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Comments or questions, Council? Seeing none, then we will move on to the next item. 6.3 is the fourth quarter variance report. Treasurer Leonard, Marjorie, are you still with us?
Certainly am, Your Worship.
Go ahead.
Okay, Chris, you go to the next one. I just like to remind everybody every year that when we go to look at this, that a budget is just an estimate of costs, revenues, and resources over a specified period of time, reflecting a reading of future financial conditions and goals. So in other words, it truly is the best guess of all staff and department heads. Okay, Chris. And again, the surplus is actually a combination of 1,950 operating account variances throughout the general ledger. So what I tried to do is hit the highlights of the variances within each section. So this year overall, tax-related revenues were $1,057,194 higher than budgeted. User fees and other revenues were $7,184,000 higher than budgeted, and expenses were $8,474,000 over budget. Chris? Going down, the surplus for the mayor and council of $73,500. It's the savings there were realized in community recognition of $3,300, employee benefits of $23,600, and those were actually based on the prior year's increase, and that increase in benefit amounts was higher than the actual increase that came out. Between all of the council members and the mayor, the professional development accounts were underspent by $15,000. Receptions, we had savings there of $6,000. And in terms of the strategic plan, we actually had provided a $25,000 budget line in there for strategic plan, but all of that work has been done in-house, and there's been very little cost to it. In terms of council grants, there was a surplus there of $81,100. Now, council grants themselves was a savings of $92,700. What happened there is that we had set aside $150,000 to assist the hospital with the planning phase for the redevelopment, and the hospital did not request a draw on any of those funds. So that's also where we provided the $75,000 support for the out of cold program. And in addition to that, the PRC in-kind support was actually over budget by $11,000. So we're going to net down to the 81. And elections, it just had a deficit of 3,100. It was. Next, Chris. Corporate management. This is a deficit of $1,805,547. So just remember that corporate management is the catch-all for many other departments. In 2019, we budgeted a total of $500,000 for the corporate reorganization. Now, those reorganization expenses that are in relation to that amount are scattered throughout the general ledger. So we tried to get as many of them in administration as we could, but there still are some areas that are in other parts of the financial statements. The judicial inquiry costs for 2019 were $5,155,584. And that is the majority of the over budget results. The net cost of the judicial inquiry is an over budget amount of $2.5 million. Now, when we take a look at that, there were various over and under budget accounts that did reduce the deficit. It would have been a lot higher than the 1.8. We had savings in areas like advertising, conferences, corporate contingency, contracted services, intergovernmental relations, building repairs. Those amounts were between $18,000 and $50,000 each. The salary contingency was 149,400 savings. Transfer to capital was 133,400. There were a few items that were over budget, and they include annual support, which is based on our computer licensing and systems, and that was $33,000 over budget. Employee benefits were $94,000 over budget. Insurance, 21,000 over budget. Insurance claims, 21,000 over budget, and salaries were over by 97,000. Next one, Chris. Corporate services, we had a surplus of 250,600 there. So the corporate services comprise customer service, Collingwood terminals, fleet and facility, IT, and HR. In terms of the under budget accounts here, there was $9,700 for annual support, again related to the computer licensing, and a $63,000 savings for software, and that was due to the timing of the rollout of Office 365. You don't just go out and buy 300 licenses, you buy each license by user. So the IT guys did so many at a time, and that's why there was a timing difference there. There was a $60,000 savings in consulting fees, and that was mostly related to the compensation review process, which just got started towards the end of the year, and then we got COVID. There were contracted services savings there of roughly $32,000 in over the various operating units that comprise corporate services. Savings of 9,800 in labor relations, 8,900 in legal fees, $15,000 in staff recruitment savings, $15,000 in staff training, and $30,000 for studies. So there were a few more savings there, but again, some of the amounts in corporate management may have applied here in terms of, and it was a little tricky to pull out what was recorded in that 500,000 than I actually initially thought it would be. So it's all bottom line stuff anyway. So Chris, if you can get the next one. Fire services, a very small deficit of 57,500. That was all in salaries and benefits. Police, a slight surplus of $57,000, and that can basically be attributed to the court security rebate. I believe that last year, 2019, I want to say it was 164,000, and we had budgeted somewhere in the neighborhood of about 97,000, which is what I believe we got in 28. So there was a surplus there. Conservation, a surplus of 13,400, and that's due to the fact that we actually collected additional, Black Ash Creek development charges. Those development charges are applied directly to the debenture that comprises most of the conservation budget. Protective inspection and control, slight deficit of about $29,000. This area includes building, by law enforcement, animal control, and crossing guards. So the deficit in this area relates to, again, this relates to the corporate reorganization. As I said, some of the expenses were in other lines on the financial statement. We have, because the building department, the CBO, now supervises by law enforcement, we can no longer recover 100% of his salaries and benefits from the permit fees, which forms part of the deficit there. And that additional expense was actually offset by savings of about 29,700. Next slide, Chris. Public Works. There is actually a total deficit here of $658,000. So paved roads, they were over budget 69,000, and that's related mostly to salaries and machine rental. Winter control was over budget $230,000. Before I go any further on this, I just want to let you know that as well with our new superintendent of roads, Daniel Cole, some of these amounts were moved from various, for instance, from traffic and control perhaps into the roads paved. So there were some movement within which of these section the account sat, but overall everything is in public works. So when we take a look at the winter control, it's totally dependent on the weather conditions. And the last couple of years, we have been over budget. We do retain a winter control reserve for a year that we would be so far over budget that we could not possibly recover it. Overhead is over budget by $449,000. That's part of salaries and benefits of about 66,000. Legal expense about 16,000. Insurance was up 18,000. The revenues came in under budget of about 80,700. And in particular, the transfer to reserve, because of the way that we record the public works vehicles, what happens is technically public works rents out its vehicles to itself. So when they look at the cost of an individual section in there in terms of paved roads, they've got debris pickups, so they would have had a machine charge to that. But when they look at it, they can then determine if they go to the open market, whether or not they're in the ballpark with the quote that they get from somebody in the open market or just exactly where they are. So what they do is they generate a more revenue, but when you have the more revenue, it increases the amount of the transfer to reserve. So actually out of that 449, 219 of it is gone to the reserve. So it's not spent by any means, but it's in reserve. So the next one, Chris. Conventional transit, we had surplus there, 42,277. And that the major components towards that were fuel costs of $33,669. They were because the price of gas was fluctuating a lot last year. And the janitorial contract was under budget by 12,600. The next one, Chris. Affordable housing. Affordable housing is a deficit of that $47,913. So these accounts are dependent on vacancy rates and required repairs. In general, for each tenant that leaves, the town is responsible to maintain the units in good condition. So we usually have anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 in repair bills per unit. And we just can't control any instances of damage. So next one, Chris. PRC, there was a deficit of in the administration accounts of $78,000. Contracted services were over budget by 16, which was due in part to some of the studies that were done initially for the Sunset Shore repair and some of the smaller temporary repairs to Sunset Point. Insurance came in over budget at 32,000, and salaries and benefits were $17,000 over budget. We take a look at parks. The surplus there is $290,930. There are a lot of accounts in parks. The magnitude of the surplus is generated through the Parks Business Unit for the last few years, between 2015 to 2018. they've all been in this range, indicating that there is a budgeting problem specifically within that department. And when we go to do the 2021 budget, we'll be spending some extra time with parks to make sure that we're not what is being budgeted there is what we are actually going to spend in a year. But along with that, the revenues generated contributed about $40,000 towards that variance, and that's more than budget amounts for rentals and baseball diamond rentals, soccer rentals, and mooring fees in particular. Salaries and benefits came in under budget by $153,000. The janitorial contract was under budget by almost $16,000. Repairs and maintenance to grounds were under budget by $19,000. The transfer to capital was under budget by $10,000. Tree planting was under budget by $16,000, and utilities were under budget by about almost $15,000. So when I say that there's a budgeting problem, it appears to be sort of related more to the salaries and benefits area. Recreation services surplus mostly through salaries and benefits. Facilities, a deficit of 63, almost 64,000. Actual revenues here were 32,500 better than budgeted, but various repairs and maintenance accounts were over budget by 39,800, and salaries and benefits were $51,500 over benefits. Culture and events had a surplus of 148,700. See, this is another spot that the actual revenues were $102,000 better than budgeted. And those that was specific contributions from federal and provincial grants that accounted for 23,000 of it, while revenues related to the Elvis Festival were 66,600 above budget. And overall expenses for the department came in under budget by 56,500. Next one, Chris. Planning is a surplus of $190,000. The vast majority of this is $140,000, and it was partly due to not awarding the official plan consultant until late, and salaries and benefits were under budget by 42,800. So that accounts for where they were, and studies also were under budget by 45,000. Marketing, the 22.5 there is just made up of several over and under budget accounts. Heritage, there's a surplus there of 62,800. Salaries and benefits were under budget by 32,900, and the heritage grants were under budget by 24,800. Next one, Chris. The airport, very small deficit. Library, there was a surplus of almost $200,000. Revenues were 46,500 better than budgeted due to the higher level of development charges collected and applied. Salaries and benefits were $157,000 under budget, which accounts for the vast majority of the $200,000. Next one, Chris. So total for all departments, our actual expenditures came in at 34,957,000. We budgeted 33,667. So we had an overall over budget of our expenses of 1,300,000. Again, the taxation revenues were above what we budgeted at 1,057,000. And the ending result there was an overall deficit of $232,666, which was funded through the use of the operating contingency reserve. So in the end, we came out to zero. And that's where the fourth quarter landed.
Thank you, Marjorie. Questions? Well, I guess I'll go to the public if we have any. Sarah, are there still people in the gallery?
Yes, there is.
Okay, well, we'll open it to public comments then about the fourth quarter variance report.
Again, if members of the public wish to participate, please raise your hand using the tool function on the bottom of your screen or put your comment in the chat. It doesn't look like there's interest at this time for this item.
All right, council, any questions or comments on the variance report? I'll start with Councillor Hamlin.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, through you to our treasurer. I see that the total amount that we were at variance, in other words, we overspent the budget of 1.2 million. Half of that is public work. And most of the money in public works is for overhead, which is a pretty big catch-all. So I'm just wondering if, I know you mentioned it briefly, but I don't think I caught exactly what the overhead amount was. I was wondering if you could give us a little more information.
Through you, your worship, the vast majority of that overhead amount there is actually the way that it's due to the way that Public Works funds their reserve. They charge out their vehicles and put the excess into a reserve so they can purchase their other vehicles back and forth. In actual fact, that's it was over budget by 219, which is the vast majority of the overhead amounts. There were $80,000 in less revenue there. And if I recall correctly, when I was looking at it, there's probably about another 40 accounts with smaller over and underages and that, you know, make it up. When I try to do it, I try to hit the highlights.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Mr. McLeod.
Thank you, through you, your worship, to I think my first question goes to the treasurer, but my second question goes to the acting CAO. Pardon me if this seems obtuse, but how is it that we spent $62,000 on our airport when we don't have one anymore?
Through you, your worship, we did operate it until I believe it was, and the deputy clerk can correct me on this, but it was this, I want to say the 16th of March. So there were costs up to that date. Plus, when we do the sales on it, there were adjusting entries that were required because we had to fill the tank, the gas tanks, and those types of things. So that there were expenses involved in the final closing adjustments of the entire deal. So that's where it was.
Thank you. My second question, I believe, goes to CAO Skinner, and through you, your worship. And this may sound a little harsh. I'm just going to look at that final number. I'm switching over my screen. So we budgeted to spend $33 million last year, and we spent 33.6, and we spent 34.9. So again, the variance $1.2 million on a $33 million budget. Is it unusual to have a variance of that size in an organization this size?
Sorry.
Or perhaps Marjorie, I'm not sure. Sorry.
Who wants to take it?
Yes, thank you.
Treasurer or?
I can fill that one, worship.
All right.
In terms of whether or not it's normal to have those types of things, no two municipalities are the same. None of them are. I can't guarantee you that I'm going to have $1 million worth of supplemental tax bills this year, because at this point in time, it's only a 1.3% growth rate. There are municipalities that have smaller municipalities. When you've got a budget of something like $7 or $8 million, when you're talking about Tiny or Tay, it's much easier to control the spending. We're dealing with large amounts. Our exceptional item here, Councillor McLeod, was the judicial inquiry. We had only budgeted $1.5 million for it, and it's just accelerated and ran right over top of us. Most times we would have we would have a surplus based on any additional supplementary taxes that we have, or any savings. If for instance, in Parks and Rec, if Wendy has a wet summer, her staff don't work it. They're not cutting the grass, right? So, or if it's a hot summer like this, they've cut the grass last week and they don't have to go back and cut it for 3 weeks. There's, other things there, but in general, where we end up is it's due to our growth in our supplementary taxes. However, this year it's the other way around because of the judicial CAO.
Right.
Would you like to add to that, Sonia?
I think I have, thank you, and through the chair, I think I have less perspective on the numbers than the treasurer does. However, in looking at the total amount, it's not fantastic. We'd like to come in at 0. It's in well under 5% variance. So while the numbers themselves are not where we, ideally like them to be, it was unfortunately one of our now 2 in a row of unusual years. I think that, COVID not accepting that an exception, that this will continue to improve, so the variances will go down. And I think it's within the realm of normal. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. If I hadn't received that answer, I would have further questions. Thank you.
Councillor Comey, I have you up.
Thanks so much, Mr. Mayor. Through you to the treasurer, thank you for your ongoing presentations and all your detailed information. I guess my first question is, please, will council receive, you gave such a fantastic detailed breakdown, and I'm trying to make notes as fast as I can. Are you able to share some of those details with us beyond the slide?
Marjorie?
Through you, your worship, I do have some notes that I will provide.
Okay, I appreciate that so much. I'll tell you my particular interest, if that helps. I appreciate and clearly heard your comments with respect to the PRC budget. A couple things I did catch, and I'm going to offer them as a general comment to our CAO and Executive Director Culver, who presented the green initiatives. If I caught it and wrote it down correctly, I heard that we underspent on our tree planting by $16,000. Is that correct? Yeah, so just
through you, your worship, yes.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's a number of reasons that can happen, but I think if we're looking to tie in our green spending and planning and initiatives, I think we definitely, as a council, would like to see all of that spent. I also jotted down that under PRC, they were underspent in janitorial. Is that correct?
Again, through you, your worship, yes, they were, but I think it has to do when they started the contract with the cleaning service. I think that it was a timing thing for that. I'm pretty sure it was, because it included not just, it was the Central Park to at the Sunset Point 3, maybe down there. And there was another spot that they were cleaning as well for Parks and Rec.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I appreciate that comment. And again, I raise that because I believe a little further down today, we're going to hear about washrooms and concerns from our residents about keeping them clean. So we want to make sure what we're hearing about underspending on janitorial. And I offer the comment that the comment about cleanliness is not new. It's contained in our PRC master plan. When we go back to that, residents have long commented concern that we're doing the best we can. So I just want to make sure if they're hearing we underspent on janitorial service, that the council and our residents sort of understand what that means. But I would appreciate, if possible, having some of those details on the PRC variances so that we can fully understand when we sit down at the table later in the fall, what we need to be looking at. I'm sure our trails our active transportation trails committee would be very interested to know how we did when it came to our trail spending as well last year. So through you, Mr. Mayor, I thank you again, Treasurer Leonard, and would greatly appreciate any other details you have on that.
All right. Any other comments, council? Seeing none, and then we'll move on to the next item, which is 6.4, Simcoe Street Pilot Project Update and Patios. And we have Deputy Clerk Dahl.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. I've had lots of technical issues at home today, so I've had to switch lots of devices around to get online here.
We're hearing you
so it's
very
just
well.
a quick update.
Yep.
Good.
Go ahead.
Okay. So through the chair to the committee, this is just a quick update to let you know where we're at. So we've been asked to provide this quick update on the pilot for both the patios and the Simcoe Street closure. We continue to receive applications for restaurants in the downtown to expand their patios beyond their existing footprint. We've currently issued 8 permits in the downtown, and you'll soon see expansions for Espresso Post and Soul Kitchen in the coming days. And there's new patios also popping up, which is great to hear. Baked and Pickled has applied for a patio, El Carbon, which is a new restaurant, The Pine, which is another new restaurant, and The Crow. So they've never had a patio before, so it's kind of exciting to see, and we'll definitely activate our downtown even further. As for the Simcoe Street pilot project, the town continues to work with all the affected businesses and individuals along Simcoe Street. This initiative was brought forward by Lowdown and BMFA back in June, with their original vision being to close Simcoe Street from here Ontario Street to St. Paul Street, to help draw people down Simcoe Street and explore some of the great arts and culture and dining located in that area. The initial request was for a 4-day closure. With that, I provided a feedback form to all the affected parties, and we received some concerns back from that. And they included disruption to delivery services and waste collection during those 4 days, removal of on-street parking for some of the healthcare type businesses along there, and also access to the laneway situated beside Moguls, because it provides access to Gordon's repair business, and as well as some of the residential apartments that are along that strip on here Ontario Street. So with that feedback that we received, staff met back up with Lowdown, BMFA, and Richard Lex to discuss the feedback based on the original proposal that they put forward. And we came up with a bit of a compromise in providing a closure for Saturdays only to help lessen the impact on those individuals that expressed some concern. So with that, Cassie from Lowdown decided that she could represent the Simcoe Street group and provided an additional survey out to all of the affected businesses and individuals, proposing a Saturday closure for July 15th and July 25th as potential dates. We received that feedback late last week and reviewed it. And with that feedback, we still continue to have some concern expressed with the closure of the laneway and the on-street parking along that section of Simcoe Street. So staff are proposing to move forward with the pilot project to close all of Simcoe Street for July 25th. With the concerns expressed, we looked at a number of options that we might want to consider. The first one was closing only one side of Simcoe Street along that area to allow for still flow of traffic, access to the laneway, and provide some on-street parking. The second option that we looked at was allowing access to the laneway by creating a somewhat of a informal lane that connects the laneway to the other laneway along Simcoe Street that goes into the Simcoe Street parking lot. And the other option was to only close Simcoe Street from St. Marie to St. Paul Street. Public Works and Engineering expressed some concern with the first two options with respect to liability and processes involved in road closures. So it was agreed to move forward with the full closure, offering reserved parking in the St. Marie parking lot to any of the businesses that express concern with loss of parking. So if we do move forward with this, I'll be providing notice to all the affected parties and who to contact if they have any concerns or questions. If there continues to be objection to the closure for the businesses within the first block of Simcoe Street, Staff will need to further reevaluate this closure and pilot project and potentially just do it in the easterly block of Simcoe Street. If the pilot's a success, we'll be looking at implementing this through Saturdays throughout the summertime. So I don't know if you have any questions with what our findings have been so far, but we hope to get this project up and running. I think it would be really exciting and something new for the downtown. Providing it on a Saturday also links it to the farmers market. When people are already downtown, it might bring more attention to Simcoe Street as well. So.
Thanks, Becky. I'm going to look to Clerk Almas to see if there's anyone in the gallery that would like to speak to this item.
I certainly know that there's an individual wishing to speak to that, and that is Mr. Richard Lex, so we'll allow him to speak.
Okay.
Hello, Council. Can I be heard?
Hi, Richard. Yep, we can hear you.
Hey, okay. Thank you very much, Mayor Saunderson. And I just want to quickly thank town staff for really all the extensive work they've done on this. I'm sure it's been a lot of time involved, and particularly the clerk's office, and I know the deputy clerk's done a whole lot on this. And just also a quick shout out to Councillors Comey, Hamlin, and McLeod for some of the early feedback with this idea. So Cassie and from Lowdown and Susan from the BMFA really presented, I think, an inspiring presentation. They went through the BIA. They were very pleased with it, and I'm certainly and the folks here on this street are very enthusiastic about moving forward on July 25th. So I'm very happy to hear that. The one concern I did want to speak to council about was regarding the laneway alongside Moguls, and Moguls and let's call it the Moguls and former Molly Bloom's laneway, and we really need to think of a good name for that laneway because it deserves a name. And but in any case, it's been an issue. It was an issue when we had Elvis because it would be closed for about 3 days, and there were alternate arrangements for the folks there, some of the residential tenants and some of the businesses to have alternate parking in that, and it never worked, and it always caused a lot of complaints, and quite frankly, it was not enforced, and people still cars were still crossing the street. If we want to create something that is sustainable, not just a one-shot event, we really need to look at providing continued access through that laneway from alongside the former Molly's Blooms to the Moguls and Prime 79 parking area. It's just not a solution to block that laneway if we do this on a sort of a regular Saturday basis in the summer. And since this is a trial, I really would encourage staff and council to give it a try. Leave that laneway open and allow cars to cross. And it wouldn't be very many cars. There's not that many tenants. I certainly, because we're talking about a pedestrian zone or a pedestrian walkway that we're trying to create, but I'm having a hard time getting my head around what the objection is or what the problem is, because every day cars cross sidewalks. There's thousands of occasions where cars cross pedestrian ways known as sidewalks. Part of this closure would mean crossing St. Marie Street. So as you go from block to block, you are crossing the street as well. And you have to look out for cars. People cross your Ontario Street all the time. They have crosswalks where they can cross. So there's a lane alongside the farmers market that has been in operation and is never closed as a result of the market there. So I do have a concern, and I know it will be a concern with some of the tenants in there, to the point where this trial could fail. We don't want to see that happen. So I'd like to really have a further look at alternatives to keep that laneway open. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. So staff have noted your concerns. Sarah, do we have anyone else who would like to speak?
Your Worship, we do not have anybody else expressing interest to speak to this item, and we do have Director Salama available if there's any questions regarding the the street closure.
Okay. Well, then I'll open it up to council. Council, questions or comments about the pilot project? Councillor Hamlin.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to our deputy clerk. I wanted to express my thanks also for our staff about all your thinking, and I can see there's been a lot of issues that you're juggling. So I'm so glad that you're pursuing this and that we're going to still have an opening. I'm just wondering, there were a couple of things on my mind that came up during the initial discussions around the closure, and I just wanted to ask whether they were on your radar. One was that the artist community organized through the Blue Mountain Foundation for the Arts would have an opportunity to set up, you know, I don't know, maybe artists on location kind of displays during the closure. Is that being contemplated still?
Through the chair to Councillor Hamlin, that is definitely part of it. So part of the closure would be allowing these artists or any other business for that matter to be able to provide you know, a display of what they do or live action painting or whatever in specific areas along the road and the sidewalk.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. The second thing was maybe allowing restaurants who don't have access to a patio space to be able to set up over there, and maybe even the parking lot behind the Tremont, for example, food carts. Has that been discussed at all?
Through the chair to Councillor Hamlin, we have discussed that. There's an issue with liquor service. They want to serve liquor because it won't extend their liquor license beyond that point. And speaking with the restaurants too, they've expressed some concern because they're already having issues with maintaining or getting staffing, and to be able to have staff at a completely different location has caused them a little bit of a problem. We would definitely consider if someone wanted to set up for, you know, the pilot day or whatever. But those are the concerns I've heard from the restaurant owners, that they're not really interested in that because of the lack of staffing.
Okay, thank you. And finally, through you, Mr. Mayor, we also had some initial thoughts around having a portion of the farmers market over there. And I did hear, and this isn't anything beyond, I'll say, gossip, but what I heard was that when our opening of the farmers market, there were 18 stalls and perhaps as many as 36 applicants for space. And so there may be some interest if we could make space. And again, you know, I don't know where it would be, but has that been on your radar at all?
Through the chair to Councillor Hamlin, I wasn't aware of that. So that's definitely something I can look at if we're looking to, you know, animate the space a little bit. That could be an opportunity for those vendors that aren't able to get into the farmers market.
Okay, that was all my questions. Thank you very much.
Councillor Comey.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Deputy Clerk Dahl. So first of all, a huge thank you to you and staff for all your hard work to get our entrepreneurs back on the street. It was a week ago today. I got to kick off the morning with the Caesar at Canada's only Caesar bar, and those business owners were absolutely delighted to be open again. So the hard work that you and staff have put forward is paying dividends to our entrepreneurs that keep our downtown thriving. So we so appreciate that. And, you know, as a follow-up, I'm going to offer this comment through you, Mr. Mayor, to you, Deputy Clerk Dahl, and staff. And I'm really just citing back to staff some of the comments that came to us in the report back in June, which was the follow-up to the recommendations by the Economic Support and Recovery Task Force. And these were staff's comments when it came to street closures. And I just want to really impart the comment that not only was it focused on economic development, right, and a way to help out our businesses with patio space, but it also spoke to improving safety by reducing interactions between traffic and people. And this one of particular importance, to promote outdoor physical activity and active transportation. So the comment I'm offering is, I understand there's a huge economic element to what we're doing. It's hugely important, but our residents have so asked for this and are so looking forward to an opportunity for expanded outdoor space and active transportation options. So when we're weighing all the comments and feedback we're getting, I just hope staff remembers its own comments and all the feedback we've heard from our public about how much they would look forward to some street space to spread out and use additional cycling and pedestrian space. And that's my comment.
Thanks, Deputy Clerk, and we'll look forward to the July 25 pilot project. And we got Fire Chief Parr over there with his hand up. Go ahead, Fire Chief.
Through your worship, just to back up some of this, that we have to keep in mind that we're still under emergency declaration, and the Civil Protection and Prevention Act eliminates and constricts gathering of certain size crowds or events, and we have to watch how we promote this and how many people gather at this in this time. So Deputy Clerk Dahl was trying to facilitate businesses that exist to be able to operate in an area that they would normally be in, and we've found that was where we tried to lead this, being on the committee. So again, there had to be a lot of concern and very cautious of how we do this street opening until the government decides to relax some of the emergency orders at this time.
Thank you, Chief, for bringing that to our attention, and certainly with the announcement from the health unit yesterday, we continue to be under the threat, and we're looking at PPE and making sure with social distancing, and when we can have social distancing, that we're wearing masks. And my understanding is at the farmers market, they are wearing masks as part of that process. So we'll have to look at that. Are there any other questions or comments, Council? Seeing none, thank you very much, Becky, for that report and that update. And your reception was excellent. 6.5, the digital modernization update, and we have Director Ridlow. Martin.
Good evening again. I am actually going to ask Catherine to join me as well. We are co-leading this project. Catherine, of course, is from Public Works, and it's a really neat partnership that we're putting in place. Thank you for the first slide. As I noted, this is something that was one of the task force's recommendations. And specifically, it actually brings together several disparate projects that had been in the works over the course of several months. And we realized there was an opportunity to actually pull them together under what we're calling the Main Street Modernization Project, with the vision of being a small town sustainability innovator by using technology to help get people walking, biking, browsing, and shopping downtown Collingwood more. As many of you are aware, we've had the Collingwood pilot project prior that related to the sump pumps. We see this as a potential next Collingwood pilot project initiative because of its ability to help not only with infrastructure improvements, but importantly, to create a stronger, more prominent, and easier to use digital discovery platform for the downtown. We've been working on this project together with the BIA because it has significant benefits, I think, for all of us. Let me pass it over to Catherine right now for the next slide.
Thank you, Martin. So with respect to the project purpose, the collective elements of this project promote three objectives within the town's strategic plan. The first one we have here is the public connections to a revitalized waterfront, including continuation of the wayfinding signage. And so this project, we want to help ensure that visitors know that they can park in the town and then transition to walking or some other active transportation option to go into the downtown Collingwood and out to the harbor as well. Second objective is supporting and managing growth and prosperity, including encouraging tourism. There are elements within this project that will educate and inform visitors and residents about local attractions, events, and businesses. And it aligns with the funding downtown improvements and facilities along the waterfront that is called out in this underneath this objective. And the third objective is enhancing community and well-being, including enabling and encouraging active transportation and electric vehicles, and thereby supporting climate change mitigation. So we're establishing and identifying year-round active transportation routes throughout the community. Often when we're thinking of active transportation, especially in the winter, we're thinking more about the trails around town. And as beautiful as they are, we have some wonderful discovery walks through the downtown core, and we wish to draw more attention to them as well. And you can do the self-guided tours in the winter, summer, fall, or spring at your own demand. Next slide, please. So this project is divided into two complementary components. One is we call the wayfinding improvement. It involves vehicular signage, which is a continuation of the wayfinding signage plan that was implemented with phase 1 last year. Phase 1 drew attention to drawing attention to the parking lots within town. And also under the wayfinding improvement, we have something that we're calling the pedestrian experience finding. This has physical features that we will have at discovery hubs around town. And there'll also be this digital element that Martin alluded to earlier, and he'll go into more detail in a moment. There is also a component called the Main Street revitalization. This includes some sheltered areas for parking bicycles, information kiosks, and that digital platform will continue on in here as well. There'll be the installation of some electric vehicle charging stations, and there'll be some revisions to the BIA electrical installations in the downtown core that support many of our events. Next slide, please. Martin.
Thank you, Catherine. On the wayfinding front, one of the things that we've come to realize is when someone punches in to Google, for example, parking, Collingwood, one parking lot shows up. A couple of businesses, some advanced businesses that have Google My Business as a well-developed platform show up, but that's it. And let's face it, so many visitors, even residents, are using Google and search platforms to figure out what to do. So the opportunity within the wayfinding project, and particularly the digital discovery platform, is make it easier to find things in downtown Collingwood. And what we have here is actually a map that we've already created that captures some of the peripheral wayfinding signage that we started working on last year. And there's still phase 2 that needs to get implemented. This is, of course, in partnership with funding from the BIA, RTO7, as well as Simcoe County. And the intent of that is to make sure that as people enter through the different entry points to Collingwood, that they're directed towards the downtown to get them to park their car and get them walking. And we know through research that once people are walking, biking, they're far more likely to shop and experience what happens downtown. But they need to know about that. And while physical maps are certainly something that we want to have, the opportunity here is to make sure that they can actually mobilize their searchability requests and figure out where to go. Next slide. So the idea is that we actually create not only a platform on which when they search for parking, they find out where the parking is, and that can be biking parking, it can be electrical vehicle parking, it can be any of our 4 parking lots, but it automatically starts transitioning their thinking into how they can actually discover the different experiences that Collingwood has to offer. And the idea here would be that it would actually highlight the various discovery hubs. We've mapped out 10 different discovery hubs within the downtown. And these discovery hubs are actually a more digital, physical ramification of some of the walks, self-discovery guided walks we've already created and are available at discovercollingwood.ca. And these include the harbor hikes, it includes a good food stroll, it includes a heritage strolls. So we have all this content, but we need to put into the digital medium. But we need to make sure that as we do everything around here, it's got that new entrepreneurial tech element to it. So the idea would be as people stroll to these discovery hubs, they actually have a chance to hook into a free Wi-Fi unit that's actually issuing a Wi-Fi signal at these 10 discovery hubs around the town and get to experience an augmented reality. So imagine if you're in front of Town Hall and you're standing in front of one of these discovery hubs, which is actually in existence already. It's that wonderful map in front of Town Hall. What we're proposing is having a Wi-Fi transmitter there that lets you hook into it and have an experience, an augmented reality experience using your phone that lets you see what downtown Collingwood looked like 100 years ago. And that includes a ship at the end of North Huron, Ontario that's launching. That is the power of augmented reality. But that also changes the experience for people coming into town that we never imagined would be possible. And that is specifically that it becomes a virtual experience that under COVID times allows people to explore the downtown on their own and experience the history, experience the stores, experience the shopping experiences within Collingwood downtown. So this wayfinding plan that we've got takes it from the physical element, brings into the virtual and digital one, and importantly also integrates what we're calling a pedestrian wayfinding feature system that lets people get around town without necessarily obliterating many of the features there with signs. Back to you, Catherine.
Thank you. So the next slide, please. So the second component that we talked about briefly was the Main Street revitalization. And if you can see on the map there on the street view, we're looking at the Pine Street parking lot as well as the South St. Marie lot. And the blue lines there indicate where we will install the 2 sheltered bicycle parking kiosks. And if you also see in the Pine Street lot, there's a red line that indicates an electrical vehicle station, and that is immediately adjacent to the transit terminal on the east side. In addition, there will be 40 electrical receptacles that are currently installed in the downtown core. They will be reviewed by an electrical engineer, to see which ones can be upgraded and possibly capping some if the budget doesn't allow for all the revisions in this phase. The sheltered bike parking will have a similar look to the image that you see there. The final design has not been set, but that gives you a flavor of how it will look. And part of the of that bike shelter will be not dedicated to bike parking. These setup will have 8 to 10 bikes in them, but there'll be an empty section where we will have a bicycle repair section as well as an information kiosk, which initially will be just like one of your normal information panel boards, but we're looking into possibly digitizing in the future, but not as part of the scope of this project. Next slide, please. So as Martin alluded to earlier, we have a large project team. There are 10 different departments represented on the core project team, which is quite a few. And we're all working together on individual elements as well as some that have a crossover, such as, like I mentioned earlier, electrical components in a number of them. This is truly one of those projects where the sum of its parts is greater than its individual components. It'll have much more of a wow factor if they're all delivered together, but not just within the town departments. We have community buy-in as well. And on our wayfinding design team, we have representation from the Heritage Committee, as well as from the Collingwood branch of the Architectural Consultancy of Ontario. So we have a lot of buy-in and support from the community as well as from the town staff as well. Next slide, please. So right now with our budget and the 5% reserve, we come in just under the total funding that we have in the books for this project. And with multiple funding sources, we're working very closely with finances to make sure that we are very clear on our tracking so that we can report back responsibly to our funders. Next slide, please. We now have a very aggressive timeline, as this project was initially pulled together in January as a team. As with almost all other projects, it came to a grinding halt in March. But now we are moving aggressively forward with a project timeline that we all pulled together and believe that while it's aggressive, is quite doable. And we hope to be in a ribbon cutting position, whatever that's going to look like, the ribbon cutting ceremony in November to align with the BIA's holiday visual display downtown, and again, the Santa Claus parade, however that may look. So that is an overall look at the project, and then now we're opening it up to more specific questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Catherine and Martin. And I'm going to look to Clerk Almas to see if is anyone. Oh, Sonia, go ahead, CEO Skinner.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you to the committee. I did want to say that this project, there was a question earlier tonight about whether we could reallocate resources for a different project. And we realized when this project came to a grinding halt that it was not going to be And we were realizing how big it was, and Martin Ridlow had taken some leadership on putting the whole group together. And we reallocated through a redeployment with the help of Public Works, Catherine, who made some time available to be the project manager on this. So I think it's a success story all around, and I'm looking forward to this particular delivery. It's put a lot of interconnected things together in a really well-structured way. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia, for that. I'm going to look to Clerk Almus to see if there's anyone in the gallery that would like to comment on the presentation we just had.
Through your worship, there is no attendees wishing to speak to this matter.
Okay, then I will turn it over to council. Are there any questions or comments, council? Councillor Hamlin.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Catherine. Thank you so much. This is so exciting. What a great team, and that was a great presentation. I have two questions through you, Mr. Mayor. One is, it's of course great to see these sheltered bike spots to park bikes. And I'm just wondering if in conjunction with that, your group is also thinking about marking safe routes for bikes. And I worry about, for example, here Ontario Street, because it can, you know, it's a really major street. There's lots of cars. There's all the reverse parking. And I know a lot of cyclists are tempted to get onto the sidewalk, and I would do the same thing, which is mainly why I don't go downtown on my bike, because I'm too afraid. So just wondering if you could address that. Thank you.
Martin, I think that you're probably more qualified to address that part of the question than myself.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor Saunderson. So as part of the funding that was secured by PRC for the bike shelters, there is funding made available through that as well for cycling signage. And it will be part of the overall signage plan to make sure that we're not only directing cars to their appropriate parking spots, but that we can also help direct bikes along the appropriate safest routes to the downtown locations.
Okay, thank you. Actually, that's all my question. Thank you. My only question.
All right. Councillor Comey.
Thanks so much, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Catherine, again, just echoing those comments and excitement. It's all very beautiful and very, very exciting. My question is with respect to the budget, please. So we talked about grants earlier tonight when it comes to some of our bigger projects. So looking at this, it seems like maybe about half of your funding is tied up in pending grants. So my question through you, Mr. Mayor, is the things that are clearly funded, will they proceed regardless of pending funding? So if I'm reading this correctly, let's say the bike shelter is fully funded, will that proceed, but the EV stations can't? I'll just sort of, I think you understand the intent of my question.
Yes, so thank you, Mayor. So through the Mayor, yes, Councillor Comey, the bike shelter is fully funded and in fact has gone to RFP, and we should have it closes on the 23rd. So the elements that are funded will proceed, and the other two elements will be, as we get the funding in, we will proceed with those as well. We're prepared to go and hit that start button as soon as we hear, and we have word that it should be happening any day now, that we should be hearing and having confirmation on those two funds.
That's a wonderful. And then through you, Mr. Mayor, perhaps we could ask Martin, when you do get a status on those grants, you know, when council's next in session, I'd just love to hear, because I think those EV stations are really an exciting thing that tie in well with all of our green initiatives.
Yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions, council? Go ahead, Councillor MacLeod.
As a follow-up to what Councillor Comey was just asking, what if the answer is no on these grants? Then what happens?
Catherine, do you want to respond to that?
Well, then we won't be able to move forward on the electrical vehicle charging stations through the grants, but there has been initiatives in support with EPCOR, so we would probably continue to pursue electrical vehicle charging stations through our alliance with them. And with response to the digital discovery platform, yes, we would have to look into other sources to support the development of that. But again, all the other elements would continue on.
Thank you.
And I guess just as a point of further clarity, if all of the funding does come through, it looks to me like the town is paying approximately 175,000 of the 740,000 rough budget, provided all that funding does come through. And to pick up, I saw Councillor Doherty's head moving. The EPCOR deal did involve installation of some EV stations in town, so I would imagine they would pick up on that. And if the funding does come through, then we will be working with EPCOR for additional EV hookups throughout the town, so we can hopefully leverage that further. Well, thank you very much. Are there any other questions or comments on this before? Thank you very much, Catherine and Martin, for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This brings us to item 6.6, the update and guidance for COVID-19 response for parks. And I think it's a tag team between CAO Skinner and Director Milanovic. So I will pass it over.
Thank you, Your Worship. I am going to speak to the presentation and then we'll save all the difficult questions for Mel.
Okay.
Well, this is a somewhat emergency update. When we set the original agenda, we didn't realize we needed to talk to council about this, but I did use some of my emergency powers as the CAO under the COVID emergency to make some decisions on the weekend. And I thought it very advisable to bring this item forward to get SIC as input now. The second slide is just a preview of the recommendations. We're asking that council receive the report and direct us to carry out the actions, including some part-time summer park staff that were funded in the original budget but have not yet been hired due to COVID. That you direct us to proceed with something we are accelerating beyond our 2021 budget ask, which is an additional a bylaw FTE, and that we look further at the bylaw continuation in the 2021 budget. So the background on the next slide is that we think this is a good news story. Other municipalities in some cases have closed facilities. They've greatly restricted access, and they forayed into areas that we weren't willing to go because we didn't feel that they were a win-win for residents and visitors. It's certainly a learning and adjusting story. And I don't think that the decisions that are recommended here will be the final decisions. I expect that as the weeks go by, both council members and staff will learn and continuously improve. We have exponential growth in volume and an explosion, particularly this year at Sunset Point and Millennium Parks. As the fire chief reminded us, this is really all about risks to the public and staff. It's not necessarily dealing with pre-existing conditions or other considerations. Particularly with Sunset Point Park, it's not easy just to say, well, why don't you count the people coming in and out? It's very integrated with the neighborhood. There's a lot of ways for cars and people to get in and out. And as a municipality grows, there are also higher service expectations on washroom hours and garbage collection and many other things. The next slide is, we've had a number of questions about COVID-related park capacity. So this is not something that our parks people had ever considered before, which is what do you do in the middle of a pandemic when people need to go to green space? So even though we can't really manage the people entering the park, Sunset Park, without what I would call unmanageable cost, extensive fencing and people, and capacity would depend on the size of people in each bubble. So two people walking together in a bubble don't take up much less space than 6 people walking together in a bubble. But we can do some estimates. And we haven't validated the calculations, but generally it indicates a capacity in excess of the number of immediate parking spaces that are left around the park if we assume 4 persons per vehicle and circle. Which would lead me to believe that further restricting the parking in the actual parking lots is not required. certainly I wouldn't recommend it at this time. The next slide talks about the temporary pilot solution, and I think you're all familiar with what happened, what the arrangements that we made last Sunday. But in case you're not, we informally restricted parking on all the side streets. We took the largest single parking area near the water treatment plant as a resident-only lot. And resident-only meant residents, property owners, business owners, and we also allowed in anyone with a disability that really, had a proof or a look that they needed to be close to the facilities. And it appeared to resolve most of the issues and complaints that had been cited to us. And we had lots of inquiries about continuing it, particularly the resident parking lot. And at Millennium Park, we increased by law enforcement. Next slide, please. Feedback was generally very positive, and there's a few there that have been noted, and even a few tears by people who were so happy that they could find the spot. And we got very positive feedback as well from the OPP. All of the feedback that we have received, and I recognize that we have not done a comprehensive request to the community for feedback, but it has been largely positive. We did have one incident where a large group was asked to either leave or break into smaller groups, and upon the return the second time by bylaw, they had not left, and they did articulate to our bylaw officers that they felt that it was racist that they were being asked to move. They received one ticket. We are firmly of the opinion that it was simply related to the number of people gathered in one place, and that a very balanced approach was taken. Next slide, please. So the recommendations today are meant to do these 5 things: help us adhere to COVID protocols, maintain opportunities for residents and visitors to access a green space with reasonable guarantees for residents to access the space, maintain emergency vehicles and AODA compliant parking, manage the overall number of users of the parks, and thus help us to manage the secondary issues such as open fires, dumping of fire coals, broken trees, and the like, and to educate residents and visitors on other parking or water access that is available. Next slide. So the recommendations for Sunset Point going forward are continuing to rechalk the circles, adding bike racks and additional garbage receptacles, to lengthen the washroom hours from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. a bit later to 9 p.m. A lot of people seem to be enjoying the evening till dusk. And we're adhering to COVID guidance on maintaining cleanliness, and have a combination of contractors and staff doing that work. And we're looking at providing advance warning when the park is full, both when you enter the neighborhood or possibly farther back, right on Highway 26 and County Road 124. Further on the next slide, we're looking at keeping the resident-only accessible parking lot. Location is to be fully confirmed. There was some feedback of moving it to the parking lot near the chipper. This requires 4 staff. These are hourly students or redeployed part-time facility staff who would be paid simply for those hours that they're working. This is not a request for example, for a full-time ongoing staff. To continue to informally restrict the parking on the 4 side streets using the pylons and barricades until such time as a more formal parking restrictions are determined by council, and that is imminent. The report has been circulated earlier this evening for the DNO agenda on next Monday. To monitor for potential overflow on the residential streets, in relation to these restrictions, because we are in a piloting and learning stage. And using Engage Collingwood or other options to solicit ongoing residents, businesses, and visitors' feedback, and in fact to communicate some of the other options for green space in town. Next slide. We had a question about the ability to restrict parking, and the Municipal Act is quite broad in the powers that it gives to municipalities, and the 3 applicable items are listed on this slide, and we can restrict parking as we wish, and under the Act as set out here. The next slide is for bylaw. And frankly, I wish we'd had much more time for analysis, because I think that there is a report slated to come forward to council around the needs for bylaw resources and the approach, short-term accommodations, etc. However, in this period, if you would wish that there is more enforcement in our parks through COVID times, and to address the ongoing underlying needs, we will need an additional position. Currently, there's 4 full-time people and the 2 summer folks in the department. They provide service 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Some of those hours are simply on call, but they're always available. Our recommendation, just based on the way that the department should be structured going forward, is that the new position be a supervisor position, and that we would fill it involving the internal and external candidates. Costs would be about $80,000 per full year, less in this year because there's not much of it left once the position's filled. We would actively seek any funding we could for this position. There's some offsets that could be available through the additional paid parking, which has not been confirmed by council, but not notionally could be starting in the fall, and the reduction of overtime by other staff. We would bring this forward in the 2021 budget with respect to overall justification. However, we would want to offer the position through the duration of 2021 so that we could ensure that we get a quality candidate and that the training time is well spent to get someone up to speed on Collingwood's bylaws. On the final slides, there's some recommended actions about Millennium Park. There's been a number of comments about reinstating the trail on the east side as you enter Heritage Drive, and the town staff will grade that trail. There's some significant deterioration that was due to fall storms, and we're going to delineate it somewhat with curb stops to keep the boat parking away from the trail. EPCOR is going to do some capital construction there, and they have not yet confirmed their dates for construction, but they're predicted to be some time away, but within this year. We had proposed to restrict parking in specific areas where the Heritage Drive is narrowed, to add pavement markings, and to add speed bumps. The potential community safety zone, the proposal is that it would be then analyzed for implementation in 2021. The next slide shows some of the no parking zones in the red line. The green would be where parking would be allowed on one side or the other of Heritage Drive. And there's some areas for authorized parking only. Next slide. We looked at a lot of options. I've included them here. I won't go through them in any detail, but I didn't want you to think we hadn't thought of some of these things, but they just were not either well enough analyzed or not recommended to go forward now. Things like elimination of cooking or fires, ways to reasonably limit the length of stays, further promotion of businesses, additional parking options, say off-site away from parks with transit to get to parks, more one-way streets or restricting turns, and the paid parking pilots of opportunities. And Councillor Madigan had put a notice of motion before you recently on that item. In conclusion, we're seeking your endorsement for the recommendations set out in this presentation, and we'd be happy to take your questions. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Sonia, for that presentation and for all the effort that's gone into this over the last less than a week. Before I turn it to council, I'll just check with Clerk Almas to see if there's anyone from the audience that would like to speak to this report.
We have one remaining attendee, and it does not look like the individual wishes to speak to this item.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So I'll open the floor to council. Any questions or comments on the presentation? Councillor Doherty.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. I cannot begin to express my congratulations to staff for being so proactive. This is thorough, well thought out, practical, and now as of last weekend, tested solution that seemed to work extremely well at the park. Certainly was responsive to the concerns of the residents in the area. And I think it's also important that it's consistent with the way Collingwood has been with our tourists, that we are welcoming and our parks are accessible. And what we're doing now is just accommodating an exceptional situation and ensuring that both our visitors and our residents are equally satisfied with the experience. And I think this proposal does that. So again, I'm very supportive, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Doherty. Any other questions or comments? Councillor MacLeod?
I'll echo what Councillor Doherty has had to say about the exceptional hard work under exceptional circumstances. We have a hot summer and COVID, and I know that many of the people who are at Sunset Point would rather be in a movie theater in their hometown, but they can't do that, and or the swimming pool in their hometown, but they can't do that. And so I'm proud and happy that we have the most amazing waterfront that we can share with the rest of our fellow citizens. And so thank you for finding a middle ground for all of us. I too am receiving the emails from people who say, I've lived here 5 generations and I deserve my parking spot at Sunset Point. And sure you do, but we all have to get along in extraordinary times. And so I just have a couple of, so those are my comments and my kudos to PRC and to the acting CAO. But I also have a couple of questions, one of which is, how many parking spots are there in those 3 lots? Theoretically, obviously the one beside the water treatment plant isn't marked, but I'm sure there's been some math done on this. Can you elucidate that for me, please?
Sonia?
Yes, I was just pulling up that number. You give me 1 second. Okay. So Mel staff did provide that earlier today. So all credit to Mel, but I have at my fingertips now at 232 parking spots throughout the park, unless Mel tells me differently, but that's the breakdown Wendy provided earlier. And he's nodding.
That would be correct.
So 232 overall, and about 75 of them or 100 of them beside the water treatment plant? Over, is that a decent estimate through you, Your Worship?
Sonia or Mel, can you confirm that?
Through you, Your Worship, approximately.
Right. Okay. So 100 over there. Thank you. So, and because you, I just wanted to confirm, because you said that that was the biggest lot. And so I'm trying to figure that one out. Is there a plan as part of this to let people know, locals as well, obviously, through social media when the park is full as well? I wonder if that might be something that could be included as part of the plan, you know, tweet out, hey, we're full, don't bother, or something like that.
CAO Skinner, Mel, go ahead. Whoever wants to take it.
Through your worship, that is a great comment, and we will implement it going forward.
Thank you very much. And another thought that I've had in the last little while is we've got 232 parking spots for vehicles. How many parking spots do we have for bicycles? Through you, your worship.
Through your worship, I don't have a number for you.
But we do have racks, right?
There are bicycle racks.
Is there a thought that there might need to be more to encourage locals to use their active transportation to get to the park rather than vehicles?
Through your worship, we can definitely look at it, see how many are actually being used over the course of the weekends. If they are full, then we'll look at implementing and getting new racks.
Super. And last one, and this one's for CAO Skinner, I believe, through you, your worship. Has there been given any thought? You said something about parking lots adjacent or in the neighborhood of the park, and I'm thinking of the one on the water side of the Pretty River Parkway, where the courthouse currently is. Should we be maybe trying to rent that and provide a shuttle?
Sonia?
Thank you, Worship, and through you to Councillor McLeod. We're very seriously thinking about that in the Legion parking lot. Having not talked to the Legion, with full disclaimer, we thought could also be potentially a fundraiser for someone like the Legion. But the reason we haven't moved forward on that at this point is because we hadn't confirmed those capacity calculations. So if you're looking at how many people are going to get out of the, say 4 people to a vehicle from the 232 parking spots into our 110 chalk circles. And we wanted just at least another weekend under our belt and a chance to check those calculations before we decided to encourage a few more people. But that's another great suggestion on the another parking lot we hadn't considered. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, to reiterate, great work and under difficult circumstances. And we're trying to be good citizens and good neighbors, as well as looking after our immediate neighbors. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions, Council? Councillor Hamlin.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor, to our acting CAO. Again, thank you. That was amazing how fast this has all happened. I have just perhaps 2 questions for you, Mr. Mayor. One is, I think I saw limited reference to charging for parking, and I know no decision's been made on that yet. But I wanted to comment that it does appear to me that all of the surrounding municipalities through to Barrie and through to maybe Owen Sound are all charging for waterfront parking now. We might be the only one that isn't. And that may encourage a lot more people to come than would otherwise. And so I'm just wondering what your thoughts are around charging for parking as this unfolds. Thank you.
Sonia.
Thank you, through the chair. I'm not against charging for parking. I think that it is a fair thing to be doing and in line with the other municipalities. However, I didn't want to, in this report, preempt the report that's coming forward to DNO committee next Monday, where it does provide an update on the parking app and the potential for charging for parking. I do, and I mentioned briefly in the presentation upon conversations with the department heads and the CAOs, the CAO's Simcoe group that, sorry, I lost my train of thought when I read the chat. Our agreement, general consensus was that people probably would pay almost any price. Some people, in fact, in other municipalities are floating the fines because they're only $60 or only $120, so they can park their car where they want for the whole day beside the beach. So we didn't feel it was as much of a user control item as a how could it better support the services that residents and visitors need type of question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll wait for the Monday meeting. My second question was I noticed, again, through you, Mr. Mayor, a reference to making sure people knew that Harborview and Princeton Shores were alternatives. And if there is some kind of notice going out around that, it might also, this is just a comment, I guess, mention there's no washrooms there. I did drive out to Princeton Shores Park on Canada Day, and I think there were about 40 people there. I did think, oh my God, maybe, oh, I shouldn't say that. I thought, oh my goodness, all these people are here for the day and there's no washrooms. So anyway, I just wanted to leave you with that thought. Thank you.
Thank you for that. If there's no other comments or questions, I'm going to put the motion on the table. Oh, Councillor Doherty, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I forgot to ask. I'm very glad to see the proposal to extend the washroom hours until 9 p.m. So many people are going down to Sunset Point now after work, and you know, there's no place to go after 6 o'clock. So is that starting immediately, or is there some target for the extended hours for the washrooms?
Sonia?
I think I should defer this one to Director.
Oh, okay, my apologies. Director Milanovic.
Through you, Your Worship, I think that's where we're looking for the recommendation that we can move forward and open the washrooms till 9 p.m. One of the recommendations.
Okay, so immediately then, immediately upon approval. Great, okay. Also, I had a question from some of the residents, and that is to the parking of watercraft on the shoreline and the use of watercraft in that area where swimmers are often found. Do we have any rules and regulations relative to watercraft at Sunset Point specifically?
Director Milanovic.
Through you, Your Worship. I'm not probably going to do the best here on this question, but I'll try to answer it, and I'll look to Executive Director Culver to assist. There are swim areas and boats aren't allowed in, and this past weekend we had the OPP ticket an aggressive boater. So yes, there are some rules around the swim areas and where watercraft can approach.
Through you, Your Worship, are those rules posted somewhere in the park?
Through Your Worship, I'm not aware that they're posted.
I wonder if that might be an opportunity for us among the other items that we will be communicating either via our website or social media to make it known that watercraft are restricted to certain areas at Sunset Point.
Executive Director Culver.
Thank you, Your Worship. This has been a bit of a challenge ongoing. So the signs in the park won't actually be seen by boaters, and the boaters are the ones who create the offense. So the challenge for us has always been to try and create buoy lines or some way of signaling to boaters where the swim areas are designated. And so far we've been unsuccessful. Not to get too deep into the rabbit hole, but the beaches are basically built on shale. We've put as much as, I think, 5,000 pounds of weight underneath the buoy and it moves. So it just gets pulled out into the bay. So it's been an impossibility so far for us to do this. We have talked about tapping into the rock and actually establishing buoy lines that way, but it requires commercial divers and a lot of expense and some pretty technical things to make it happen. So we're not able to sort of draw the line for boaters. So we rely pretty heavily on the OPP doing some education patrols. If they get too close, they pull them back. Essentially, even your recreational boater license talks to you about giving appropriate distance to swimmers. So really, it's a provincial and federal type of situation versus a municipal responsibility. But we would love to draw that line, and if we can find a way to do it, we definitely would.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
All right, Councillor Comey.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor. Hang on, now I'm locked out of my iPad. I'm going to pull a Councillor McLeod and say, just to be sure what we're voting on here. In the recommendations, when it comes to washrooms, sorry, I lost my spot because my iPad went to sleep. And I apologize, I'm pretty sure I read it to say on weekends and holidays, the washrooms hours will be extended to 9 p.m. So through you, Mr. Mayor, Director Milanovic, is it every day of the week the washrooms are open till 9 or just on weekends and holidays?
Director Milanovic?
Through you, Your Worship, it would be 7 days a week.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, well then I'll read the motion and get it on the table, and I'll look for a mover and a seconder. The motion is the council receive this report and direct staff to carry out the recommended actions, including part-time summer park staff. The council directs staff to proceed with the immediate recruitment of one full-time employee, bylaw enforcement supervisor, revising the full-time complement to 5 bylaw officers through to the end of 2021. And that enhanced bylaw enforcement services, including the hiring of additional summer students, be reviewed for council's consideration during the 2021 budget. Can I get a mover and a seconder, please? Moved by Councillor Madigan and seconded by Councillor Doherty. Seeing no more comments, I will call the question. All in favor? And this is carried unanimously. Thank you. And our final item tonight is 6.7, which is the lobbyist registry update. And we have our accountability officer, Jocelyn McCauley, with us. Go ahead, Sarah.
Sorry, our individual attendee has requested to speak. We can wait until the public delegation period.
Yeah, I think that would be best. That we're one item away from the public delegation period, and so we will certainly give our attendee every opportunity. Thank you, Sarah. Welcome, Jocelyn.
Thank you, Your Honor. So I will keep my update brief for today since we're nearing the end of our meeting. So I'm here today to provide you with an update on the newly implemented lobbyist registry. So for the sake of time, again, I'll be brief. So we're nearing the end of our 6-month education period as set out in the lobbyist registry bylaw, after which time the bylaw will be in full force and penalties may be imposed. Since implementation, an initial round of staff training was conducted and public outreach was carried out through newspaper ads and on social media. More recently, I developed templates as well for use by town council and staff to ensure a consistent response to lobbying activities and that proper procedures are followed. In addition, the town's website has been updated to create an online presence that is more engaging and easy to use with clear information on the use of the registry. This recent revamp also included the launch of a registry search function, so users can now search the registry by lobbyist type, subject matter, and using keywords. Since the registry was first introduced in January of 2020, 37 lobbyists have registered, either through the online submission form or directly through my office. So while the 6-month education period is nearing its end, I do hope to continue to expand outreach activities and training. So this will be done through group or one-on-one virtual training sessions. I know some of our counselors recently completed some training, and this hopefully will continue. And in addition to that, this training will be offered to all town staff as well as to the general public upon request. So in addition, with respect to enforcement of the registry, and the corresponding code of conduct, I will make sure that every effort is made to provide appropriate training and resources before enforcing any penalties. So that was a very brief summary of my presentation for today. And I will pass back up to you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn. And I know you're extremely busy. Before Sarah, I will just check with you to see if attendee would like to comment on this before I put it out to council, and then we will allow council comment and questions.
My apologies. It looks like we have no more attendees participating.
Okay. All right, council, any questions or comments? Councillor Berman.
Thank you, Mayor Saunderson. Through you to Jocelyn. First of all, thanks for the great training that we did on Friday. There was one area that I forgot to bring up. We have a large number of resident ratepayer groups, I guess you would call them. And I just jotted a few down as I was thinking of this. We have the Collingwood Art, Culture and Entertainment one, CASE, I think you pronounce it. We have the Save the Collingwood Grain Terminals. We have the Tree Street Coalition, and we have just this weekend the Sunset Point Resident Association. Do these groups, because they're specifically setting out with the goal of talking to councillors to persuade them, to back up their positions, do they count as lobbyists?
Yes, so through you, Your Honor, the registry does require these individuals or these types of groups to actually register through the registry. So what they would do is, rather than register as an individual, they would be registering as an organization or as a group. So if you ever receive requests like this, simply forward them along to my office and I'll make sure that these individuals register. So whether or not you have a meeting upcoming where you believe the activities may constitute lobbying, simply either contact my office in advance, or the individuals have the ability to register within 10 days after the meeting takes place.
10 days after, okay. And then, excuse me, sorry, through you, Mayor Saunderson, as a follow-up, because I know there's a few of us that have had people register, and the group on the website, it names who it is that they were lobbying. So that would be the case in this case too. So I'm just to use as the recent example that was in the paper. So there was this Sunset Point group that met on the weekend. So they would also have to list who in particular they were lobbying.
Yes, so typically when they're entering their information, they include their name, they include the name of their organization, and they include the type of lobbyist that they are, as well as the individual who they lobbied. So in that case, they, on the website is listed either specific names of counselors like yourself or names of staff. But on the website, we specifically list the position title instead, but upon request, we can provide the specific name of the individual as well, because a record is kept of all of these submission forms.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Yeah, that answered it perfectly.
Councillor Hamlin.
Oh, I guess I'm not muted, so there we go. Okay. Just as a follow-up through you, Mr. Mayor, to Mr. Berman's or Councillor Berman's comment about the Sunset Point meeting. Because I was there, I took it as a group of, open to the neighborhood. For anyone to come to provide, ask questions, basically. Are those kind of, informal, impromptu neighborhood come and talk also required to register? And what do they do? Register as individuals, or how does that work? Because here's my view, that residents, that's why we're there, to hear from our community, and they're not lobbying for, anything beyond, community affairs. Anyway, have you thought through that? How does that work? Thank you.
So through you, Mr. Mayor. So where it is simply related to community affairs, like you're saying, so if it's a group of individuals coming to you expressing concerns about certain aspects of the community, that typically doesn't constitute lobbying. If you're ever concerned that it may have become a lobbying activity, that's when you can come to me, and because every case is different. But if an individual is coming to you in your official capacity just to express concerns over something that's going on in the community, that isn't lobbying. It's where the individual is trying to specifically influence the development of public policy for personal gain in a way.
Yes, thank you so much for clarifying that.
I guess just to follow up on that, Jocelyn, lobbying in and of itself is not the problem. It's just making sure that it's done in an accountable and transparent way. So I guess when in doubt, it's probably safer to register than not register.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I would agree. So lobbying itself is a legal activity. It's part of our democratic process. All we're seeking to do with the registry is to make sure that all meetings that aren't held in public forums are made publicly aware to the public. So they're aware that these different conversations are happening and why certain outcomes.
Any other questions or comments, Council? Councillor MacLeod.
Thank you. So I'm trying to navigate the space between the comments from Councillor Hemlin and the comments from Councillor Berman. And so in a situation where a neighborhood group and there's any concern that there might be some lobbying, could councillors then suggest that they depute, depute to council rather than picking a couple of councillors to talk to? Would that be something that we should be encouraged to be doing?
Jocelyn?
So thank you, Mr. Mayor. So wherever possible, it is ideal to go through a public forum. So individuals are able to make a presentation to council and in committees like this. So we do like the idea of it being as transparent as possible, but there will be times where meetings do take place, and when those meetings do take place that aren't publicly available, where it may be a one-on-one conversation, then in those cases, that's where the activities need to be registered through the lobbyist registry.
Okay, thanks.
I see the CAO's got her hand up. Go ahead, Sonia.
Your Worship, and I would also add that typically where we are seeking to make a public policy type of decision, staff will go through a process such as Engage Collingwood as well to seek community input. And in many cases, we want to direct, sort of a consistent approach to getting community-wide input through that type of a process. It doesn't happen in every case, but we do try to design that in as well to the major decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Councillor Comey.
Thanks so much, Mr. Mayor. Through you to our new accountability officer. Sorry, I was trying to pull the policy out and couldn't put my hand on it. I guess I'm further confused by this too, because our new, let's say our new councillor office expense fund includes an allowance for councillors to host community meetings or coffees and chats with his or her constituents. So when a councillor sets up a coffee and a chat or a neighborhood discussion on any community matter or as an open forum, are we saying that that's considered lobbying?
Jocelyn?
So through Mr. Mayor, so a situation like that wouldn't constitute lobbying. So it's an event that's made publicly available. You will likely have advertised the fact that this event is taking place. And so long as it is open and transparent, there is no issue there. The issue is where the activities are not taking place in a public forum. But again, it really depends on the situation.
Clerk Holmes, go ahead. Sarah?
My apologies, through your worship, and I'll just add to our accountability officer's comments that, again, if you're hosting something like that and someone is trying to provide some pressure or influence a decision that's going to happen or they want to happen, even if it's at one of these types of events, I would still encourage them to register.
Wow, I guess I'm even more confused now. I'll give you just real life examples because those are super helpful. So I think all of council received an email, let's say from a resident the other week on Finley Drive, and we were invited to sit down with this resident and chat further about speeding on Finley Drive. And I took this resident up on the offer and had a socially distanced meeting with them on their front lawn about their concerns about speeding on Finley Drive and made notes about this. That is considered a lobbying effort because everything our residents have concerns about. They generally want some type of action. They want less parking here. They'd like a tree branch removed. They'd like things to slow down. So isn't that the very nature of being a councillor, to be a conduit to these concerns? I mean, I took this to be much more from concentrated group efforts that are trying to sway a decision one way or another. So I don't know, obviously I need some training on this because I'm really confused now.
Well, I think it's partly a question of context, but the training is excellent. Councillor Berman and Jeffrey and I myself took training last week, and it is a new lens to look through our responsibilities. But so I would encourage everyone to get the training if you have questions. Jocelyn will make herself available. And I know she's very busy doing her master's, but hopefully when she gets that through. But no, it is very much a paradigm shift for us, and it's part of our transparency and accountability protocols. So so we do have to be aware of it, and we do have to make sure that if we have concerns, that we address them with our accountability officer. So if there are no other questions or comments, I will go to item 7, public delegations, but I think we lost our last council or attendee. So hopefully we will follow up or have him or her back on another date. So that brings us then to the adjournment. Councillor Jeffrey. Motion to adjourn. All in favor? And that is carried unanimously. Thank you very much, everyone. That was a busy meeting.